I'd like to call to order the Housing Task Force meeting of November 8th. Hi. And could you please call roll, Mr. Rao?
Don Olson,
Here.
John Campanella,
Here.
Kathy Murillo,
Here.
Sheila Lodge,
Here.
Bendy White,
Here.
Michael Jordan, Jason Dominguez. Thank you.
So we have, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Kathy Murillo on her strong performance and being our next mayor. Okay, so are there any changes to the agenda?
No, sir.
Okay. Then, let's see, do we have any comments on the minutes or a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve.
Chair White,
Sorry,
on page 4,
Mr. Olson?
in the middle of the page, staff comments, the last sentence in that paragraph, Scott Vincent, the last sentence doesn't make sense.
Page 4.
The anti-NIMBY law
Right.
sentence
Well,
doesn't make sense, okay? Any suggestions on making sense out of it? Let's see.
There's some
We
words
have a-
left
we have
out,
a
or there's,
Concern on that. We just, Mr. Vincent, do you have any comments on that, or just, should we just refer it back to staff for fix?
For correction?
Mr. Chair, a correction that would make it an accurate statement is that the anti-NIMBY law limits the rules and regulations to those in effect at the time the application is deemed complete.
fine.
Good, thank you. All right, Mr. Campanella?
Just on the subject items, the legislative update and status of AUD projects, there's really no comments made, except that they were held. Would it be worthwhile, maybe even the pictures of the slides that were presented during that, so people know what we spoke about, maybe being put on the website?
So your suggestion is that we add to the minutes the slides that were presented on that topic as part of the minutes?
We can certainly do that.
Great, okay.
Just one more if I can. A comment Mr. Dominguez made on the 1.24 bedrooms on the AUD affordable. That's true. They're average. There is one project that's designed for families in the mix, one of the 5, as you see from the detail, on Salsapuerta Street. And then the other 4 are special needs, if you will, with 1 bedroom. But it's certainly a true comment. We need more family housing in that bracket. But right now we only have 1.
So your suggestion for the minutes is?
No, I just suggesting a little clarification that there is 1 project for families right now in the affordable, and the rest of them are sort of special needs, the other 4 projects.
Okay.
So just to clarify that point, if
Okay.
So a
Mr.
clarification,
Dominguez
there's a
is willing to
total
do
of
that.
5 projects and only one of them is a family project, and
Yes.
that's why the average is 1.24 bedrooms?
Yeah, and also why we would need more family projects, because we only have 1.
I think that's the exception that clarifies the rule.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
We have those clarifications. We have a second, motion by Dominguez, second by Jordan. All right. Any other comments? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. The minutes are approved. And then announcements. Any announcements from staff on this? Okay. So public comment, I have one slip here from Anna Marie Gott. Is that on? Anna, yeah, there you go.
Chairman and board members, developers have set their sights on city-owned parking lots downtown for development of market rate rentals. The city owns these lots. We need to start a conversation to determine what conditions the city would insist upon in a contract if it were to do one or more of these deals. Finally, we have an opportunity to create true affordable housing. This should not be market rate. This should not be affordable by design. These units should be affordable by covenant. I think that a discussion having taken place at the Housing Task Force is the perfect opportunity for us to begin a conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else have a comment? Okay, on the agenda item. Okay, great. All right, well then let's move on to our agenda item, the administrative draft nexus and economic feasibility studies presentation. Mr. Rao?
Hi, I'd like to introduce Reed Kawahara from Kaiser Marston Associates that will walk us through the draft studies.
Great, thank you. Welcome.
Slips coming in. Good afternoon. Reed Kawahara with Kaiser Marston Associates. It's good to be back. You may remember that I was here in July at the outset of our work effort describing the scope of our work and our approach and methodology and so forth. And over the course of the last few months, we've undertaken the analysis, produced an administrative draft report, which I believe you have a copy of, and come up with some preliminary recommendations, which we will discuss today. So we have a presentation here to discuss the results of the analysis, summarize the results of the analysis, obviously be available to answer any questions that you may have. And at the end, we'd like to go over the recommendations and have some discussion amongst the members about where to go from here. Okay, so we thought that it might be good just to remind everyone what it was that we were scoped to do in this assignment. There were essentially three aspects of the assignment. The first was the nexus study, and I'll just read this quickly. The nexus study is to determine the quantitative relationship between housing units developed through the AUD program and the resulting need for affordable housing. The second task of the work scope was to prepare an economic feasibility study, which was to evaluate the extent to which affordable housing requirements would help to address the housing needs of the city's low and moderate income households while not significantly constraining the feasibility of new projects. And finally, we were asked to make some preliminary recommendations. One, to determine the appropriate level of affordable housing fees, and two, to assess potential modifications to AUD parking incentives. So this is a slide we actually had in July where we were talking about the methodology of the nexus study. So I'll just go over this really quickly just to remind everyone about what the concept of the nexus study is. Again, the idea here is that when you have new market rate housing developments built through the AUD program, there will be new residents in those projects. Those residents will spend money throughout the economy and produce the need for a variety of different jobs. And some of those jobs will be lower paying jobs. And those lower paying jobs create the need for affordable housing in the city. So that's the nexus between new market rate projects built in the AUD program and the need for affordable housing. So that's what's being done in the nexus study. So where we start with the nexus study is what are the prototypical market rate units that are being built through the AUD program, and what does that mean in terms of household incomes and expenditures? So this next slide summarizes the 6 prototypes that we analyzed in the program. We analyzed a rental prototype and a condo prototype for the 3 density tiers, the priority housing overlay tier, high density, and medium high density. You can see on the chart there that we have a range of densities from 20 to 57 units per acre with the rentals and 17 to 43 units per acre with the condos, with a range of unit sizes, roughly 800 to 900 square feet for the rentals, roughly 1,000 to 1,200 square feet for the condos. And you can see the pricing. The pricing was based on a market survey that we recently did of primarily rental projects, because most of the projects that we're seeing being built are, in fact, apartments. But we have apartment rents that are in the rough range of $2,800 to $2,900 per month per unit. And condo pricing, we estimated it between roughly $900,000 and $1 million per unit. Again, the prototypes themselves were based on an evaluation of the pipeline projects in terms of unit sizes, in terms of bedroom mix and parking and so on and so forth. So you have in your package, and it's been made available, the entire Nexus study report, which is quite lengthy, has a lot of data, has a lot of explanation about how we arrived at the conclusions. I am going to jump directly to the results here, which I will summarize. So basically, what we do is we estimate what the total fee that you can charge for market rate units in order to mitigate the affordable housing impacts that are created by the new projects. And those fee ranges depend on the type of unit and the household incomes that are estimated for each housing type. And so we have a range for rental projects. Those range from roughly $58 per square foot of livable area, which is basically the area within the unit itself, to roughly $63 per square foot. For the for-sale condo projects, those fees are higher, and that's a reflection of the fact that the household incomes for condo projects are estimated to be higher than they are for apartments. And those fees are as high as $79 per square foot to $83 per square foot. So these fee ranges, because we do these studies all over California, these fees here are quite high relative to many of the studies that we do. And in large part, that's due to the high cost of living in these units, and also a function of the fact that these are relatively small units. As I said before, AUD units tend to be roughly 800 to 900 square feet in size. So these really represent sort of a legal maximum. The Nexus study is being done for purposes of the Mitigation Fee Act. So the way to interpret these numbers is the city can't charge fees any higher than these. You can charge fees up to, but not in excess of these fees. Now, when we come to the recommendations, you'll find that we are recommending fees that are quite significantly below these, which is in part why I didn't feel a need to spend a lot of time on the analysis of the Nexus study, because there's so much room there above the fees that we're actually recommending. So then moving on from there, kind of skipped ahead, okay, to the feasibility study. So once you know kind of what the legal maximums are from the Nexus study, the next question was the question of feasibility. And so the question there is, how high of a fee or how much of an on-site affordable housing requirement could you charge or impose before you start to really significantly impact on the feasibility of new projects? So that's really the purpose of the feasibility analysis. So in terms of methodology, what we've done is we've created a pro forma model. The pro forma is used to estimate the economics of these new AUD projects. It estimates what the costs of development are in terms of land acquisition, in terms of construction costs, in terms of design costs, and so forth. It estimates the rents and condo prices that we were referring to on the earlier slide. And then it generates an estimate of what the project returns are, and the returns are a measure of profitability of the project. Obviously, these are being built by private developers. There needs to be an appropriate profit margin in order for them to proceed. And so we are measuring the reasonableness of the profit margin and whether there is room there to impose additional requirements. Once that pro forma has been built, we then use the pro forma to test different variations with levels of affordability, different variations of housing fees, and different variations with parking requirements. So a quick word about the pro forma and how it can be used and how it has, in some cases, some limitations. For one thing, what we've done here is we've done a pro forma feasibility analysis of prototypes. So that is to say we've selected what we consider to be prototypical AUD projects or sort of average projects. It obviously is not trying to model every project of the 60 some odd projects that you have on every site because obviously we don't have the ability to do that. So it's limited by the fact that it's analyzing prototypes. And we recognize when we do that that there are some differences that are inherent from project to project. The second is that a pro forma is by its nature a snapshot in time. So it's analyzing what the costs are to build projects today. It analyzes what income and condo price potential is based on current pricing. And it analyzes return thresholds or profit margins that are based on current conditions. And we know that with pro formas and with development economics that it's a dynamic market and that those conditions change over time. So while we will come to some conclusions around feasibility today, those exact conclusions probably won't hold forever for the next 5-10 years. Although there will be some general trends that I think we can take away from the analysis, irrespective of that. I do want to say, make a comment here also about this concept of elasticity of land costs, because that is important in the context of feasibility. The one thing that we know about development in Santa Barbara and certainly in the downtown area is that land costs are very high. And it's a cost, obviously, that needs to be borne by the developers and borne by the project. And the issue of elasticity is the extent to which, if the city were to impose new requirements, be that a housing fee or be it additional parking requirements that will impose higher costs on projects, to what degree will that higher cost be adjusted through a reduction in the land price in which developers can acquire sites? So in other words, if the city were to increase an affordable housing cost of a fee, let's say of a couple $100,000 per project in total, and a developer can only afford to pay $200,000 less for the piece of land, would the property owner be willing to sell their land for $200,000 less or not, or somewhere in between? So that's the concept of elasticity. The answer to that question, as you might imagine, is not very precise because it will depend obviously very much on the individual property owner and to what degree they're willing to make that adjustment. Our experience in other markets, because we confront this issue a lot, is that there tends to be some elasticity in land costs, but perhaps not enough to fully absorb the costs of new housing requirements. But I think that is important to keep in mind as we talk about feasibility of projects. The final thing I'd like to say about feasibility and pro formas is that we target a return range, the profitability range that we think is necessary for feasibility, and that's what's being depicted in this little chart on the bottom here, where for apartments, we are estimating that sort of feasibility threshold range is between 5 and 5.5% return on cost is what we refer to it as. So with anything that's below 5%, we sort of consider those to be somewhat marginally feasible, and anything above that range would be more feasible. But I don't want everyone to take away from this range that it's like a black and white issue where it's like a light switch where anything below 5% you just turn off the feasibility switch and it's no longer feasible. It's really like it's a continuum of feasibility. It's more like, a better analogy is probably that's like a dimmer switch. And the more you turn the knob below 5%, the dimmer it gets. And so it's not like necessarily anything below 5% is not feasible, but obviously the more you get below that range, the less feasible it will be. So those are the kind of caveats I wanted to make about the pro forma analysis. So let me then jump to the feasibility results. And actually, before I describe these, let me just say one other thing. What I was describing in terms of the return thresholds, those were all based on a rental project. Now, we did in the report analyze, as I said before, for sale condo projects, and that feasibility sort of profit threshold is different for condo projects. But we really focused mostly on rental projects, in part because we know that the vast majority of AUD projects are apartments. I think we have 2 condo projects of the 60 some odd projects that are proposed. And the other reason for that is that the city already has an inclusionary housing program for sale projects. And as of now, I don't believe that there is an anticipation that that program will be modified for sale projects. So that was the other reason for sort of focusing on apartments. So now, on this table, what we've tried to do, we obviously have a number of variables that we've tested for. So what I've done in this chart is to create a matrix of all the different variables that we've run. And as you can see, there are quite a few. And I was trying to make this table as simple as I could. I started out with a whole bunch of numbers on here, and I thought it might be better and simpler to absorb if I just put yeses and nos and marginals and so forth in terms of feasibility. So the way to read this chart is if for each scenario, if it says yes, that means yes, it's feasible based on our threshold analysis. In some cases, it says marginal. So as I said, it's not within that feasible range, but it's marginal and may be feasible based on improving conditions and so forth. And then I also have a category for what I call slightly marginal, and it's abbreviated there for marginal. And that's anything that's between 4.9 and 5%. I wanted to put that in there because I have a number of variables, a number of scenarios here that are very close to being at that 5% threshold, but not quite. So it's sort of in that 4.9 to 5% range. So I wanted to make sure I kind of captured that in this table as well. So on the left-hand side of the first column, you can see the affordable housing scenarios that we ran, starting with no affordable housing. Then we tested 3 scenarios with a housing fee of $20, $25, and $30 per square foot. And then we tested 3 scenarios for on-site affordable housing, 5%, 10%, and 15% at moderate income. Moderate income is defined as households earning up to 120% of AMI, or area median income, and that's in the range of $80,000 to $85,000 per year, depending on your household size. And I have a table that we can refer to if there are questions more specifically about those income ranges. And then running across the top of the chart here, we have the different scenarios for parking. And so we ran basically 2 scenarios for parking, and they're all driven by an interest in increasing the availability of parking in these projects. So we said that if a project were to increase that parking, on-site parking requirement with a conventional side-by-side parking space, that would produce a certain result. And then we also analyzed what the economics would be if you were to produce that additional parking in a stacker unit or a parking lift. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that, it's basically like a rack where you park one car on top of another. So many of you may have seen them, but they're not terribly common here in Santa Barbara, I don't believe. Anyway, that's the concept of a stacker. Stackers tend to be better from an economic perspective because they're cheaper to build, but there are some offsetting factors that we can discuss. And just a quick point on the parking ratios. So basically what we analyzed here is we assumed that the parking ratios would be increased from the current ratios, which are 1 space per unit for studios, 1 and 2 bedroom units, and 2 spaces per 3 bedroom units. That's current. What we assumed here is we're increasing the 2 bedroom units to 1.5 spaces per unit. So it's a little bit of an increase in parking for the 2 bedrooms. We left the other unit sizes the same. So we still have 1 space for studios and 1s, and we still have 2 spaces for 3 bedroom units. So that's what's assumed here. So maybe just to walk through, and maybe just, I should have said this at the outset, this chart is reflecting projects outside of the CBD. On the next slide, we talk about projects inside the CBD because we're treating parking a little bit differently there. So just to run through, you can see, I'm not going to summarize this entire table, but you can see roughly how the numbers are coming out. You know, the current condition with no affordable housing requirements are on the top of the chart, and you can see everything is feasible under that scenario. Then you can see as you start layering in different requirements with different fees or different on-site affordability, how that starts to impact on feasibility of some of the scenarios. So maybe rather than spending any more time on this chart, we may want to refer back to it when we talk about our recommendations, but this is basically the approach we've utilized to evaluate the different scenarios. So again, as I just said, the prior slide was on projects outside the CBD. We've also analyzed projects inside the CBD, and the reason why the difference is because we've treated the parking situation a bit differently for projects inside the CBD. And I think the concept here for projects inside the CBD is that there is an opportunity for projects to take advantage of existing parking resources, in particular city-owned garages in the CBD that are not well utilized in the evenings, which tends to be when parking for residential is most needed. And so I think the concept for projects inside the CBD would be that projects may have the ability to reduce their on-site parking requirements, utilize existing city garages, which are already there and paid for, as a means of helping to incentivize more residential development in the CBD, which I understand is one of the policy goals of the city. That's the reason why we considered CBD projects separately from outside the CBD. So you can see the results here. Obviously, with the reduction in parking ratios inside the CBD, the scenarios on the top of the chart for parking are different than they were outside the CBD. So what we considered for projects inside the CBD was that instead of providing on-site parking, projects would instead be able to pay an in lieu parking fee. So that essentially means that if developers are not providing the on-site parking, or at least the minimum of 1 space per unit inside the CBD, they would pay to the city an in lieu fee for that reduction in parking. And the city would then utilize those fee revenues for a variety of parking-related improvements, such as, for example, making improvements to the city garages to make them appropriately designed for a mix of residential and commercial uses. So that's just an example of how those revenues could be used. You can see that, so we've analyzed priority housing overlay in the CBD and also medium-high density areas in the CBD. And as you can see here, there's quite a significant difference in the feasibility results between the two areas. Just to remind everyone, the priority housing overlay allows housing densities up to 63 units an acre. In medium-high density designation, you're only allowed up to 27 units an acre. So it's quite a big difference between the two. And what we found running the numbers is that while the densities that are permitted with priority housing overlay are high enough to generate feasible projects with this reduction in parking ratios, it's the opposite for the medium-high density projects. And the reason is because the densities at up to 27 units per acre are simply not high enough to support the high land costs in the CBD. For those of you, you can probably picture the AUD map, and I can certainly, we have a copy of the AUD map loaded onto this here if we wanted to look at it. But the medium-high designated areas of the CBD are primarily along State Street. And so those are the areas where the medium-high density tier is currently located. And what we're finding is that there aren't any AUD projects being developed in those areas. And I think that this feasibility conclusion is largely what explains that, or certainly in part what explains that. Okay, so let's keep moving. Okay, so now this is where we start to talk about the preliminary recommendations that we have made. A word about the feasibility, or about the preliminary recommendations before we get into the actual recommendations is how did we, as the consultant, how did we arrive at those recommendations? So first, obviously, we did the feasibility analysis. We found that there were certain scenarios that were feasible and some that were sort of marginally feasible, so that was clearly driving some of our recommendations. The Nexus study itself, as I said before, really created that ceiling of your housing fee. So that probably didn't weigh in our recommendation terribly, but that nonetheless was part of the consideration. And probably most importantly is the third item here, which is that we know that the city has a couple different goals that are sort of competing goals. The first goal is that we want to have more affordable housing and we want to have more parking, both of which have cost impacts on projects. The second goal is that we don't want to significantly constrain market rate development. So because those goals are somewhat opposed, what we were trying to do as the consultants here was to sort of strike a balance between those two. And so it was tricky for us to sort of figure out what we thought the right balance was, but we developed a recommendation based on our own judgment about that, and that's obviously up to the task force and others to weigh in on further. But just so you understand how we arrived at the recommendations that we did. So with that said, I will now summarize the preliminary recommendations that we have made for AUD rental projects. So number one, in regard to on-site affordable housing, we have concluded that a on-site requirement in the range of 10% at moderate income is appropriate given the criteria I just described. And we wanted to focus that requirement on projects of a certain size. And so we determined that a cutoff of 10 units and larger might be the appropriate size to trigger that requirement. Smaller projects tend to have more difficulty absorbing on-site units, and this cutoff is also consistent with the city's current inclusionary requirements. So that was another reason for setting that threshold. We also are recommending a rounding factor, again, which is consistent with the city's current inclusionary program, wherein projects that require a fraction of 0.5 of a unit and larger would round up to the next unit, and 0.5 and below would round down. So, for example, if you have a 13-unit project and you had a 10% requirement, that would require 1.3 units. You would round down to one on-site unit, and you would have 0.3 left over that we are actually going to recommend that you charge a fee for that additional fractional 0.3 of a unit. So that leads me to the next item here, which is the affordable housing fee. So this would, the fee would apply to projects of less than 10 units, and again, those fractional units. And we're recommending a fee in the range of $20 per square foot. Again, that's driven in large part by the feasibility analysis and this striking a balance between these goals. Third, in terms of parking ratios in projects outside the CBD, now, we understand that there is a perception that these AUD projects will create parking problems for the neighborhoods because the ratios at 1 space per unit minimum and 2 spaces for 3-bedroom units aren't perhaps sufficient for all the on-site parking demands. So we've assumed the parking ratios that I was describing before, where you're increasing the 2 bedrooms to 1.5 spaces per unit. And what we found in running the feasibility analysis is that increasing those to those ratios is probably doable, given the analysis that we've done with feasibility and given the affordable housing recommendations that we've made. Then moving on to the parking in lieu fees for projects in the CBD. So we felt that that $10,000 per space parking in lieu fee was an appropriate amount given feasibility considerations and given the city's goal of wanting to incentivize housing projects in the CBD. And finally, we had discussed previously this issue of the medium high density designation in the CBD and how that's problematic for the feasibility of those projects. We would recommend from a feasibility standpoint that you might want to consider increasing the densities allowed in that area if the objective is to create more housing projects within the CBD. So that really concludes the presentation. What we've done here in the remaining slides is to set forth a series of questions which we prepared here as a sort of guideline for the task force members' discussion of these various topics. So we have one slide that deal with the affordable housing questions. We have another slide that deal with the parking questions. And we have a final slide that deal with related issues. And let me just say one other thing about these related issues, because I haven't mentioned this before. It's number 7. The issue that jurisdictions always need to confront when they are adopting new requirements, whether they are new affordable housing requirements or new parking requirements or whatever, is to what degree do you want to impose those new requirements on your pipeline projects? Do you want to apply them to all your projects, or do you want to apply them to certain projects only, like projects that are further along or that are sort of newer projects? And so a lot of cities, in considering those issues, will adopt either some kind of phase-in of those requirements or a grandfathering provision, so that projects, for example, that are ready to pull a building permit aren't all of a sudden imposed by these new requirements, just as an extreme example. So when we talk about these new requirements, we should also be thinking about in the back of our minds, what projects are we going to apply these to, because that could have some impact on what requirements you choose to pursue. So that really is the end of the presentation.
Well, thank you. So then, as far as how we would then tackle this from here, you've obviously laid out these however many questions there are. And then perhaps, David, you could comment on this too, because we have also the staff list here of recommendations.
That's pretty much a summary of what he just presented.
Okay, so they're okay.
And what we did is lay these questions out in hopes that we would tackle the affordable housing page, question 1, with comments and questions from the task force and from the public, and then move on through all the way through question 8.
Okay, very good. I'm struggling with how we're going to get, how many rounds of public comment do we get in on these? Starting with, here we go. Okay, so question number 1 On-site, does the city wish to require on-site affordable units for rental projects? Perhaps what we can do is, we'll get public comment on this, and then, first of all, let's do questions. We have questions at this point, and then we'll have public comment, and then we'll come back for our comments. So, questions? Mr. Jordan?
I can jump right in. So you kind of glossed, well, I don't know if you glossed over, you kind of went right by that 5 to 5.5% return based on your methodology. And so I guess my obvious question in my mind is that
Move the mic closer to the mic. Yeah. Thank you.
where'd you get that number? Who'd you talk to? Is it a credible number when you're like talking to that guy in the front row? Or should it be a higher number in Santa Barbara?
Okay, that's a good question. So a couple more words about the profitability range and the returns that we were discussing, the 5 to 5.5%. So just to say a few more words about that. So first of all, we consider that to be what we call a blended return. And so when you're financing these projects, they are financed with typically with a combination of debt and equity. Debt requires a different return than equity. And the returns are a reflection of the risks that are involved. For a lender, the risks are around repayment of their debt, and they tend to be in a more senior position in terms of repayment than the equity does. And so, as a function of that, as a function of the lower risk for debt, the returns on debt tend to be lower. So that's one part of the equation. On the equity side, equity requires higher returns because there's more risk involved, and therefore there is an appropriately higher return on the equity. So when we talk about a 5 to 5.5% return, it's really a blend of the higher return for the equity and a lower return for the debt. So that's one point of clarification. In terms of where the actual range came from, the 5 to 5.5%, it came from a variety of sources. One is that our firm works with developers up and down California on these types of projects. Now, obviously, Santa Barbara is a unique place, and it's a unique real estate market, and so certainly there would be appropriate adjustments for Santa Barbara projects to reflect some of those unique characteristics. But nonetheless, we certainly have a kind of range of return expectations that we know that developers are seeking based on our familiarity with projects elsewhere. We've also had the opportunity here to have some discussions with some local developers. I didn't mention this before, but I was here also after the initial presentation to this group in July to meet, to conduct a couple of outreach meetings, one of which involved a group of local developers. So we did have the opportunity to discuss. Actually, I had some offline telephone conversations with developers after that meeting, in which we discussed a little bit some of the return requirements. So it was informed as well by those discussions. And I'll say one last thing about the returns, which is that, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but the other way of looking at returns is looking at cap rates in the market. And capitalization rates are basically, it's a measure of profitability when you sell an apartment project. And cap rates are at very low rates today, and it's reflecting really high values for real estate, not only in Santa Barbara, but throughout California. So the data that we been able to come up with is that return cap rates are today roughly in the 3.5 to 4.5% range is what we've been seeing here locally in Santa Barbara. And so the way to think about the returns also is the spread between the 5 to 5.5% return on cost and a cap rate that you could sell a project at 3.5 to 4.5%. And that difference represents a profit margin that you could realize when you sell a project. So that's yet another tool that we utilize to arrive at the return thresholds.
Okay, I would hope maybe a couple people in the audience who are close to that type of discussion too might offer their opinion when we get to public comment on that too. Similar question, you had a page up there that talked about rents for rental prototypes based on existing AUD projects in the pipeline. And same question there, if these projects are in the pipeline, how did you project what the rents will be before the next 1,000 of them are actually down on the ground and renting?
So this is a slide I have in sort of my backup package here, anticipating certain questions that might come up. So this is a chart that came out of the report itself, which is, so this chart summarizes the apartment rent comps that we were able to pull when we were doing this analysis. Now, this assignment was somewhat challenging in that we were trying to analyze AUD projects, and yet, as we know, there have been very few AUD projects that have actually been completed. I think there have been 6. We haven't had rental information available for all of them. We certainly have information about the mark, which is charted here on this. But we did pull rents for older apartment properties in the market, which are being reflected by the dots on the bottom part of that chart. And those are older properties. Now we're talking about properties that were built in the 60s and 70s. So we really feel like we needed to recognize a premium over those units. And really, the rents probably are approaching something closer to the mark, because the mark obviously is a brand new project. It's obviously a very high quality project. We felt that the rents for a, quote, prototypical AUD project might be slightly below the mark, because the mark has a lot of amenities that most of the smaller AUD projects probably just can't have because they're not big enough, like a swimming pool and a spa and a health center and so forth. So we priced the rent slightly below the mark for that reason. But at the end of the day, I'll admit that it's a subjective judgment. But you could see here that that these were the sort of data points that we utilized to make that judgment.
I have 2 more questions. The second one will be kind of a rhetorical question based on that. And then the other slide that you had, a set of slides where you show, I actually have 3 more questions. You showed a slide where in the Central Business District, it was all yeses if you were using the high priority overlay. Did you do any work on, or do you have any opinion, or do you know, does it have to be the maximum high priority overlay number, or do you have some lower numbers within that range that would also be all yeses across there?
That's a very good question. Here, I'm just going to pull up, since you asked the question. So I also have here the map for everyone that, or those who may not be familiar exactly with the boundaries of the different density tiers in the CBD. The medium high density tier we're referring to here is along State Street, as I was saying before. It's the pink area. Those are the medium high density areas that are not in a priority overlay. And again, those are the areas where you can only do up to 27 units per acre. And as I said before, it's also an area where you're not getting any residential projects. Now, to your question, which is a very good one because we asked ourselves the same question, what density, if there is a need to increase the density from medium high, what level do you really need to get to make them work? I mean, do you really need to get to 63 units an acre, or can you live with 36 units an acre? That is a very difficult question to answer, and I'll explain why. It's primarily driven by the lack of information around land costs. Now, the one thing that we did do, much like we did for the apartment rent comps, we also have comps for sale of development land parcels in which AUD projects are being built. there aren't a lot of land comps to work from. In fact, I do have a slide here which I can pull up to illustrate the point. This is maybe a little bit hard to see, but this is a map that identifies the land sales that we were able to identify for purposes of estimating land costs for these projects. The 4 blue ones are the what we consider higher density project sites, which are sort of in the 60 units per acre range. We have only 2 in the red that are in kind of lower density projects, more in the 20 to 25 units per acre. And then the rest of them in that sort of grayish, dark gray color, those are older comps. So we're talking about comps that go back to 2014, maybe early 2015. So obviously, the older you get with these comps, the less reliable they are. We really like to focus on newer comps for obvious reasons. And the reason for me showing this map and sort of explaining this to you is that the availability of land comp data is not very plentiful. And so to speak to the question of if you were going to buy a site in the medium high density area of the CBD, what would it cost you to acquire that site? If you look at this map, the data that we have to inform that, the answer to that question is actually quite limited. So I think that's my way of saying that we really think that the densities need to be higher than medium high, but as to how much higher, it's really hard to say. I mean, if I were to guess, I would say you probably will need to go more toward the priority housing overlay densities, closer to the 60 units an acre, rather than the 36 units an acre that's permitted in the high density.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a kind of a rhetorical discussion question I'll save for later.
Okay, great, thank you. Mr. Dominguez, you have questions?
Let's see, when you talked about the parking in lieu fee on the slides, that's in addition to the affordability fee. So that'd be a combination. So I think this is slide 9.
Yes.
So to use an example, in that first column, there's a $10,000 fee, and then they would also pay the $20 per square foot fee if that was a choice that was made.
Right. They're a combination.
Okay.
That's right.
Because I've heard higher number for the parking in lieu fees, so it's a little bit lower here because they're also paying the affordable housing fee.
Right.
But you could also do the $20,000 fee, and then it still pencils out in the priority overlay.
It does. It does. I just to restate, the reason why our recommendation was the $10,000 per space was not as much driven by the feasibility question as it was around the city's policy goal of wanting to incentivize residential projects in the CBD, and we thought that as much as you can keep the in lieu fee lower, would that further encourage development in the CBD.
Is there anything that communities have done in lieu of an in lieu fee to provide transitional parking? Like an idea I was thinking about is if there was a possibility, if there was a nearby parking lot or undeveloped parking that could be easily turned into a parking lot, could you put that on a 10-year lease or provide parking? I think a lot of people are hoping that our parking needs will be reduced, or at least the peaks, which are what are really damaging our communities. So I'm wondering if other communities have any ideas aside from this solution.
Yeah, when it comes to parking, there really are a wide range of potential solutions. Now, obviously, what we're talking about here is somewhat unique in that you're utilizing an existing city-owned parking facility to help solve this issue. But there are other, a lot of cities really try to take the approach of reducing parking demand rather than increasing parking supply. And so that could be accomplished in a variety of different ways. So, for example, one might be this concept of unbundling of parking, which I think may have been discussed with this group previously. The idea there is that instead of having parking come with the price of your unit, whether it's the condo price or in the rent that you pay a separate price for the parking space. So you could have your unit without the space, or you could pay more and you can have the parking space. And so the idea there is if people know that they have to pay more for the parking, that would incentivize people to have, less parking. So that's the concept of unbundling. There are other approaches that can be taken. Transportation demand management programs, TDM programs, where the landlord will provide, for example, subsidized transit passes, or they will encourage more bicycle riding. They'll have on-site parking, rooms to provide secure parking for parking. And so there are a lot of approaches and strategies that can be used. Obviously, we really only considered one approach here, but the possibilities are almost endless.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Lodge, do you have questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 3, B, effectiveness of the AUD program, AUD project sizes are generally small, with roughly 60% of the AUD projects smaller than 10 units. And of course, my big goal is to get rent-restricted, affordable units on the ground. Did you look at requiring the requirement for providing on-site units at a smaller size project, say if it was an 8-unit project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did. Before we came up with the recommendation of the 10-unit threshold, we analyzed the on-site affordable housing scenarios, the 5, 10, and 15%, irrespective of unit counts. So we applied them to all the projects that we were considering. So we applied them to 8-unit projects, and we applied them to 7-unit projects. And so it was only when we started to think about the recommendations did we come up with a threshold of 10. And again, that threshold was really driven in part by, again, the fact that the city's existing inclusionary program has that cutoff, so we thought some consistency might make some sense. But that's not to say that you couldn't have a requirement below 10. But see, the other problem you have, obviously, is that if you have a 10% requirement with under 10 units, you're only going to have a fraction of a unit. And so you could round up, as we were just saying before, at the 0.5 threshold, but that might have, a quite significant impact on a very small project. So there's that consideration as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I think well, tell me if I misunderstood what you said, that there tend to be smaller units in Santa Barbara and higher costs than elsewhere because of the land costs. And of course, the whole point of this, one of the points of this project, the AUD, the test program, was that when smaller units were built, they could get more per project, and land costs per unit would be less. But it doesn't sound as if it's having that effect.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right that with the objective of the city's program was to result in smaller units, higher density projects. And certainly, as we've seen with our proposed AUD projects and projects in the pipeline, that has been the result. I mean, we are getting relatively small units through this program. As I said before, the projects in the pipeline tend to be in the 800 to 900 square foot range. So they are smaller, and as a result of that, the costs per unit and the land cost per unit, for example, are lower than you would have with larger unit sizes. So that's certainly one of the benefits of the program from an economic perspective. But what I was saying about the fact that Santa Barbara has high land costs and high construction costs, which is certainly true as well, that applies irrespective of the size of your unit. But I do think that a lot of these projects are being made feasible as a function of some of the incentives that are part of the AUD program, such as the higher densities, such as the lower parking ratios, which in part certainly is the reason why you have so many proposed AUD projects today, whereas you had very few multifamily projects, apartment projects, proposed prior to the AUD program.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking of the mark where I think the largest unit is still less than 900 square feet, and the highest rent is 4,100. So I guess it's just an example of the rents will be what the market will bear. Is that's what's happening?
Well, there's no doubt of the truth of that statement.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the report and all your good work. So 1.5 spaces for 2 bedrooms. That's sort of, and was that something that you ran by? You said you talked to a group of housing consultants or housing developers, and is that one of the things you talked about?
So first of all, just to say something about that. So the 1.5 parking spaces for a 2-bedroom unit was not a ratio that we derived. That was staff that recommended that we make that assumption and to run our analysis with that assumption. So we, Kaiser Marston, did not derive that ratio ourselves. As to your question about whether we ran that ratio by developers, I don't recall having that explicit discussion with developers. Let me just say a quick thing about that, though, while we're on the topic. Most of the projects in the AUD pipeline are parking at the minimum, the 1 space per unit. And I think, obviously, developers are feeling comfortable that parking at that ratio is satisfactory for the market. Otherwise, they would build more. Now, there's one obvious exception to that, which is the MARC, which is providing a lot more parking than 1 space per unit. And in part, I understand from having spoken with the developer about that, is that's driven by the location of that project, and perhaps the residents of that project may be needing a little bit more parking than might require, for example, in the CBD. And the other is simply that that's a much larger project, as we know, and when you have a project that's of that size, physical size, you're able to accommodate more parking than you could if you had a very small site, like less than a quarter of an acre, let's say, which a lot of AUD projects are. So it was, I think, probably a function of both the market demand at that location and the physical ability to accommodate more parking in that particular project.
My second question is about parking and stackers. And is that the wave of the future? You know, what's your sense? I know we do have some in Santa Barbara, or maybe someone else from the audience. I too am interested in what the public comment will be today on the
Well,
parts.
yes, that's a good question. And actually, we touch on this a little bit in the report itself, but the real wave of the future is no parking, actually. I mean, we're talking way in the future probably, but the trend is that of reduced parking, and obviously, you know, with the Lyfts and Ubers of the world and with autonomous driving. So that's the real wave of the future. But in terms of your question around the real sort of near future, we really do see parking lifts as increasing in popularity. We are certainly seeing a lot of them in the San Francisco Bay Area. And again, there are some projects here in Santa Barbara who are now doing them too. And really it's a function of the reduced cost. Partly it's a function of the reduced cost of providing the parking itself, but it's also a function of it's a design issue as well, because again, with these small AUD sites, being able to fit parking on a small site is tricky. I mean, architects will tell you that. And so sometimes you just can't fit all the parking on a site. And so parking lifts are a way of solving that design challenge as well.
Well, help me a little bit. So is it two of them on top of each other or three, and then there's some deluxe model where there's four?
Well, there are a wide variety of different types of lifts. The two-car stacker is kind of like, obviously it's the minimum. You have one car on top of the other.
Okay.
But there are some that have three. You have some have four. Some of them will have underground pits. So basically, the lifts will go up and down, and so you can access the cars that are higher up on the lift without pulling out another. So they can be complex systems, but they also can be somewhat simple, depending on the type that you want.
Those are my questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
No?
Thank you. If I can, just following up on a couple of questions Ms. Murillo made. On the, to start with the 1.5 cars per two-bedroom unit. Repeating again, you did not consult with developers or architects. And it's really, staff mentioned that to you to look at that way. And I think have you looked at any site plans or project plans on projects that have been approved to see where or how the parking would fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was here in July, one of the purposes of me being here, in addition to obviously to presenting to you all, was to sit down with staff to review project plans for that very question. How are these buildings being laid out? And to this point, how is the parking being addressed? Now, unfortunately, we didn't have access to most of the plans for the projects. We were able to review a few, and we did have a discussion with planning staff about how these projects are being parked. But because of the availability of the plans, we weren't able to see the physical plans as much as we would have liked for this assignment.
Okay, so your pro formas, and I appreciate the way you put them together, trying to get all the variables in, which is great. And it's the input, I guess, is part of the question. The assumptions you use versus reality is probably where I'm going to go on some of my questions. But you look at two alternatives for parking. One is surface parking, and the other one is stackers. But we're faced in the city on either smaller sites trying to avoid parking structures, especially in multifamily neighborhoods. Also, there are some priority projects that are actually, looking at surface parking around them as well. When you start increasing parking, you calculated an incremental cost per space. But did you think about the fact that it could be a quantum modification of the project as you add this parking, which is not just an incremental per space, but it's a cost added to every space that already exists?
Yeah. Yes. I'm glad you asked that question, because we asked ourselves the exact same question when we were considering these options of increasing parking on a site. Because obviously, if you provide more parking, you need more either land area or you need more building area to accommodate the parking, or to the extent you're able to accommodate entirely in lifts, maybe you don't need to modify it as much. So we did ask ourselves those same questions, and when those kind of questions came up, we thought, well, wouldn't this be great if we had an architect as part of our team to help inform some of those questions? Because as the economist, we're running pro formas, but when we did that, we didn't have the benefit of being able to consider those various design considerations. And so that is certainly one of the limitations of what we did from a feasibility perspective, is not really having the design experience borne out in terms of especially the parking issues.
Okay. As far as the Synergist Santa Barbara's AUD program being primarily the higher densities being in commercial zones, Is this fairly typical that you've seen when you've done other studies relative to the, one, the cost of land, secondly, the ability to convert the commercial to residential? Is that pretty standard, or are we somewhat different?
Well, it's fairly common. Well, let me break that into pieces. So it's fairly common for jurisdictions to pursue higher density and mixed use development projects in commercial areas. Mm-hmm. So that's quite common. And it's also quite common that land costs will be higher to reflect the higher densities that are being achieved. And actually, when I was talking before about the land comps, it certainly is true that the higher density or the land that is being sold in those higher density areas is higher than in the lower density areas.
What about the fact that the commercial property, especially when you talk downtown, you were trying to get appraisals on land costs, but wouldn't the value also be dictated by the cap rate on the existing commercial property?
Yes, it would. And that in itself is one of the challenges of acquiring development sites in Santa Barbara, is that, as we know, certainly in the AUD areas, we're talking about infill areas now that are mostly improved properties, improved with commercial uses or maybe some residential uses in some cases, some of which may be occupied and tenanted at generating income. So you're buying not just the land itself, but you're also buying income that's being generated by existing improvements, which is yet another reason why you have high land costs here in Santa Barbara. As I was talking before about the land comps, I think most of them did have improvements on them, and so the values there did reflect the value of not only the land but also of the improvements.
Mm-hmm. The cap rates that you mentioned for, I guess, rental property or income property of 3.5%. As we look forward to the future, is there a chance that more of a chance those cap rates are not as favorable to the land seller, let's say, but due to the fact that we have very favorable interest rates right now?
Yeah.
Is the risk that someone coming in based upon your 5 to 5.5% spread to the 3 to 3.5%, is that likely in underwriting, let's say, that one would be more cautious going to the future because of the potential rise in interest rate rather than a decline?
Yeah, that's a good question, and as you can imagine, it's a question that developers are asking themselves a lot about, because when you're preparing a pro forma is a projection into the future. Obviously, you're not building a project today; you're building it a year from now or whatever. So what you're doing is you're forecasting what rents are and cap rates and development costs are into the hopefully near-term future. So inherently, there's some of that. Now, if you ask any investor or any developer what their perspective is about the market, you'll probably get a variety of different answers. Mm-hmm. Some are going to be more bullish than others, I imagine. I would tell you, though, however, as it relates to your question around cap rates and interest rates, that we have been at a historically low interest rate and cap rate environment in the last year or two. And the sentiment that I tend to get from developers and investors here and elsewhere is that with and this sort of plays into this question too about where we are in the cycle of the real estate cycle, where we've been in a very strong period, obviously, up until, well, we still are, I think. But the question is, are those conditions going to start to change going forward? Are interest rates going to start to rise? Are rents going to start to flatten out? So we are hearing that from some developers. And so I would imagine that those return thresholds might start to creep up. So maybe another 5-10 basis points. Obviously, it depends on what your time horizon is. But I would say generally, if you were to poll developers and investors, probably you would find that the sentiment would be rising in interest rates and rising returns.
Okay.
Somewhat.
Just two more quick ones, if I can. One on I sent a question over on your pro forma relative to your return on costs. And as you're adding either fees or which add to the cost, or affordable rentals, which reduce the cost, did you adjust your returns given the fact that there would be more equity required in your blended rate to come up with your return on cost?
Well, to answer your question directly, the answer would be no. When you talk about, I was talking before about the sort of combination of debt and equity, and obviously that split does inform the blended return to 5 to 5.5%. What we're seeing with multifamily projects today is that loans are, they tend to be in the 60 to 65% loan to cost range, something in that range. Obviously, it depends a little bit from project to project. Now, if you were to impose affordable housing requirements, be them fees or on-site inclusionary, could that impact on the amount of debt that you can secure? Potentially, yes. Not necessarily. I wouldn't say that would necessarily be the case in every situation. But as a general rule, is it possible that blended rate could increase as a function of new requirements? It's possible, yes. But I would say that it's still within the range of the 5 to 5.5% that we're talking about.
Okay. Thank you. Last question. On the inclusionary recommendations, just so the public understands, there is a difference between what's being proposed here as a possible providing affordable housing or inclusionary, in that this is, if you provide it, it's taking a market rate unit and converting it to below market. Whereas the current inclusionary program that the city has on for sale gives you extra units to provide those affordable units. And I know we're talking high-price condominiums versus middle market rents, but did you, I guess I wanted to make that clear, but did you anticipate any additional units, let's say, to provide the affordable in any analysis on the rental, or was it always a use of the current market units to provide affordable?
Yeah, we did not run any scenarios where the affordable units were additive to the market rate units. So it was always, if you added an affordable unit, you were reducing a market rate unit.
Right, and this was because this was an impact fee study, not inclusionary zoning or state bonus density or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the city can do it however they want. I mean, obviously, we could have analyzed it with the affordable units additive to the market rate units, but no, we did not consider that as of yet.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Olson?
Yes, the parking in lieu fee. I assume you had conversations with the downtown parking district staff or board members about that.
No, we did not.
So the $10,000 fee would go to them, would go for any projects that pay
Well,
that fee?
typically, it's a city fee in lieu of providing parking, and so the fee is paid to the city, and I suppose that it could be paid in. I mean, and I think typically it would be paid into a parking, in some kind of fund, into a parking fund, which are being utilized for specific parking uses. But I can't speak to the specifics here in Santa Barbara.
We have Rob Dayton in the audience. I think he'd like to comment on your question.
Mr. Olson, yeah, we've
One second.
had actually.
Rob, hang on 1 second.
Rob and I have been in email correspondence, but on that, I had wanted to bring this issue up.
Well, let maybe answer Don's question first.
Well,
and then...
it ties into that because there are other issues, and I'm hoping Mr. Dayton can answer them. The Lot 10 and 2 were built as mitigation measures in part for Paseo Nuevo. Are there, so might that create conditions where some of these things we're talking about can't be done? Also, the rest of them, there is an agreement with the property owners who pay into it to provide the parking.
Right.
And how does that play in? In other words, it may not be so. I mean, we've been very casually talking about using
Okay.
the parking, and there may be reasons why it can't be. So,
Okay, well, that's, yeah. All right, back to Don. Sorry about that.
No, I think Sheila's right, that it's more complicated than just paying a fee. Most of the properties in the Central Business District are now paying an annual fee to the business district or the downtown parking program to pay for the parking lots. So how that relates to this one-time $10,000 fee per unit, I think we would need to take a closer look at it.
So when we think about using the downtown parking facilities for housing residents with cars, we're shifting gears in our policy making. Our policy making right now has been very clear and very effective in that we serve the customers of the downtown and we do not serve employees. So essentially we provide all the parking and then we price it out so employees aren't parked. They go into the neighborhoods, and then we have the residential parking program to protect the neighborhoods. So that's how we've done it since 1981. So introducing the residential parker is a difference, primarily because the residential parker has different parking behaviors. The customers, we want to get as many in and out and spending money. We don't want employees there all day because they could take up a parking space that could be used for customers. So a residential space could also be used, take up a customer space. That would be a concern. But we do have 3,300 spaces that are completely unused in the evening, which is the peak demand for a residential use. That's primarily when they would be used. So first addressing the mitigation or the parking that would be structure 10 and 2, Ortega Garage and Candy Perdido Garage. Those garages were specifically built for Paseo Nuevo and provide that function. But as we move over time and as your consultant is talking about, the future is really not is parking is less parking, and those garages in particular are losing. They're not full, and when they used to be on weekends, they're not full, and so we have that capacity, and it wouldn't be an issue for the environmental mitigation as long as we keep the capacity for the use we're supplying. Then, so in lieu fee, what would be the purpose if we had in lieu fee? Whatever that amount, what purpose would we imagine we would do? Well, in order to protect the customer parking, we would need to set the garage up so that the cost is extremely low during the evening when we have high availability and no one's there currently, but then have that cost go up during the day. And how we would do that is we would, and we've been working this, we have this in our plan, is to convert the garage to what it would be a closed loop system. In other words, the gates would always be in the down position. Now at night they're opened, and there's no cost past 11 o'clock. Currently that's what it is, and the cost doesn't start until 8 o'clock. So we would change the reso fee. We'd close the parking so it would be closed, and then we would charge for a 24-hour period, and then we would vary the price. So if a residential parker parked in the evening and then left during the day to go to, say, like a job in Goleta, for instance, because they just absolutely need their car and they're not going to walk to work because they're not working downtown, then they would have a very low-cost parking applied to them. And if they wanted to stay, there would be a higher cost, which would be an incentive for them not to stay. The in lieu fee would be used to set that system up, that closed loop system, and eventually have it so that we know exactly who's in the garage, who's paying, in a very high customer service where you're not dealing with tickets and things. You just have everything on your phone, and it's really seamless.
Okay, great. That's it? Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. White. Yes.
I wanted to ask if there's another backup slide that they may want to present before public comment.
Another backup slide on?
On page 4 in the draft, it talks about new worker households per 100 market units. Did you happen to have a backup slide on that?
I'm sorry, I don't have that. on a slide.
Okay.
Do you want to look at this and maybe explain it to the public? I think that's something that's very critical to the understanding of this.
Yeah. So this is a table that I'm sorry I don't have a PowerPoint slide for it, but I'll describe it. And if anybody has a copy of the Nexus study, it's page 4 of the Nexus study draft. But again, the purpose of the Nexus study is to quantify. So with these new market rate units and the new households that occupy those units, they will spend money throughout the economy, and then they will create some of the lower paying jobs. And obviously those lower paying households need housing themselves. And so the table that I'm looking at here is estimating the number of new households, new worker households per 100 units at different affordability levels. And it analyzed extremely low income, very low income, and moderate income. So those different affordability tiers. But maybe just to summarize, if it's sufficient, that of those 100 market rate units, we are creating the need for, or we're creating 18.4 worker households that are at 120% of AMI or less. So essentially, low income households or lower income households. Yeah, is that, yeah.
All right.
Just to clarify, so that's for every 100 units of market rate rentals that are put onto the market, like the Mark, to use a specific example.
Right.
And you gave us the number 18.4,
4.
and those are 120% and less, but then the bottom line is 25 units because there's 7 units of additional market rate housing that needs to be built. So you're actually perpetuating the problem because these 100 units actually then require more units to be built even at the higher income levels.
That is true. Yeah, in addition to the 18, you also have 7 that are above moderate. That is true. That is true.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Mr. Jordan, you had one more question.
Fill my mouth.
Sorry about that. Want me to, I'll ask mine then until.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I have questions, Mr. Dayton, about the parking. So the $10,000 that is in this study puts forward as a one-time cost that a developer would have for using a CBD unit, a CBD parking space. You're saying that in addition to that, how you envision this working, and obviously appreciate feedback from our consultant, that there would still be a continued cost that space would incur, and that the tenant would be required to pay this low fee, this night versus day fee that's built into the city system. That's a fair.
That's correct. It's essentially the same as unbundling.
Uh-huh.
We've talked about that before,
Right.
is talking to the developer and saying, okay, you're required to unbundle, so your spaces are separate costs from your units, and then that drives the demand for transportation, and it pushes it to where we want to do great planning by having people move less and shorter distances so that we have less congestion. This relates to Councilmember Dominguez's question when he asked about other parking facilities. The reason the in-lieu fee is low is because it doesn't go to building other facilities. We have the facility. We're just going to supplement the way we run the facility, and then the user would pay for the cost. And then I didn't answer the PBIA question. Just with your permission, the PBIA is the downtown workers. They pay 10% of the downtown parking budget.
Right.
So it's 1 million out of 10 million, and that's for the maintenance of the parking garages. So that goes to the maintenance, not the use.
Okay. And then, so thank you for that. And so is that built into then that cost of the parking? I mean, we're trying to get to some.
You're referring to the annual cost now.
The ongoing.
Yeah, no, at this point, no, to answer your question, we did not factor into the pro forma per se an ongoing fee to utilize the city's garage. Now, That, though, would not necessarily be reflected in the project pro forma. It obviously would come out of the pocket, I would guess, based on the concept of it being unbundled, that it would come out of the cost of a resident.
Right.
And wouldn't be reflected in the pro forma directly.
It just seems like it's a cost that's, you're doing all this examination of numbers, and then here's one that's outside of your domain. And
Yes,
that's just what it is.
It is not directly considered. No.
Okay.
Yes.
Then also, you raised the area of concern about CBD and the need for higher density. But there's also I think it's kind of an understood piece that there would be mixed use. And Mr. Campanella brought up mixed use as that's almost virtually an assumed use in the CBD as well. So how do you put the higher? I mean, if land is going to be allocated to commercial use, then you're not saying that they need to have then the 60 units or whatever it is per acre on top of the commercial space, are you? Or how do you as economists take those two concepts and without even having an architect around to?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because up until now I haven't had the chance to mention the mixed use concept, because it's certainly true that a lot of the AUD projects do have mixed uses in them. They'll have ground floor retail or commercial uses. I mean, they tend to be not a big component of the project, but a lot of the priority housing overlay projects in particular have some element of mixed use in them. And what we found in analyzing the economics of the commercial pieces of it is that now it's going to depend a lot on your location. As you can imagine, if you're a retailer or if you're a restaurant, that location is everything. And so the rents that you can get for a space in the CBD probably are going to be a lot higher than they would in some kind of outside location. But if you assume that you're in a fairly good commercial location, that the rents actually are high enough to support the development costs to a point where it's not like the residential project needs to subsidize the commercial component of it. So I would think that for certainly the areas that we're talking about in the CBD, at least a lot of them, mixed uses would be an appropriate use, and would be the fact that they're mixed use would not inhibit the feasibility of the project.
Okay, but I'm not understanding how you get to a density. Your recommendation, as I understood, was that the need appears to be there to go to a very high density, to the highest level of density, when there's a floor that's already preempted.
Yeah.
And that just is, maybe those two concepts need to
I'm
run
sorry.
side by side.
Yeah, I understand your question. Yes. We really didn't analyze different combinations of residential and commercial, because I think your question is a good one, in the sense that if you were to increase the amount of commercial space, which generates money, obviously, to what degree could you reduce the amount of residential that you might need, and what is the kind of balance there? I think that's the question. We really didn't test different scenarios around that, but it could be considered. But I would say, as I don't want to be terribly restate what I just said, is that if you're going to have retail or commercial space that's generating real income for a project, it does need to be in a good location. In general, I would say a lot of those areas probably are good, but probably not all of them. So it does depend.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay. So back to, did you have one last question?
I have just one rhetorical question, and I'd like your opinion, and it's really to everybody else sitting up here too, and that's if the current version of the AUD is dead, is that it won't equal affordable housing, in your opinion? There yet a slide at the end of your presentation that showed some city goals that were conflicting, and one of them said not to overly constrain future development. Well, there certainly is a set of opinion that exists to constrain the development that's happened up till now. And the other alternative is that there's another set of opinion that really wants some version of affordable housing, right? So my perfect world is you get both of those, is if we figure out how to slow it down a little, but the end result is only affordable housing. Your slide on the equivalent of rental comps, I think you said you used existing rents plus the mark, and I didn't see an explanation in there on whether 1,000 new units, rental units put on the ground in the city in the next 5 years, if that actually drives down rents, or if that just continues the same paradigm of rising rents and keeping up there. So I'd be interested in your opinion. I'm interested in the rest of you kind of responding to that too, because I think that's still an elephant in the room on are we just burying this thing and looking for another avenue then to address affordable because the AUD as we know it won't, or is there some hope for it? So,
Well, as to your question about whether, if all of these AUD projects are built, whether all of those units will have the result of reducing the rents because there are just more units out there, you know, the demand supply imbalance in Santa Barbara is so great that my sense is that the number of units, and we're not talking, but they're not all going to be built in one day. I mean, they will come in over time. That they probably won't impact rents throughout the market in any tremendous way. I mean, maybe marginally, but that's just my opinion.
Okay, great. All right. Well, let's go to public comment now then, and starting with Greg Reitz, to be followed by Keith Rivera.
Good afternoon, Greg Reitz.
Reitz, excuse me.
Great report. Thank you very much for it. And thank you very much. Got to get recorded here. My comments were around not necessarily the goal of providing more affordable housing. I think it's a great goal. It was about looking at it in the bigger picture and making sure that we don't take any steps that are going to cause unintended consequences. My view of, this potential project that may in the future be required to have 10% affordable units in it is that from a developer's perspective, we're looking at a zero-sum game. So if you're going to increase the costs on this project, I have to deliver a project that has a certain profitability because that's what the market expects and that's what the investors expect. So that doesn't change. My cost to build it doesn't change. So what happens is probably the price of land goes down. And if it doesn't go down, then that means that there's some other use that's competing for that land that's willing to pay that price, right? So now I've got this affordable, or this apartment building that I could build, but instead it's not going to get built because it's too expensive to build it, and someone's going to build an office building there, or they're going to build condos there. And this report was not asked to analyze that. It's done, with a very narrow scope, and I would think that it would be instructive to see it in the bigger picture. So do we end up getting more condos as a result of this, or do we end up getting more office space, and are we having a negative effect that we're not intending to have? So no argument with creating more affordable housing, and it's very common in many communities, so I can see why it's going in this direction. But I want to be careful, especially this part in the cycle, right? We talk about real estate cycles and what happens and what expectations are, and this 5 to 5.5% return on cost is maybe a few months old, because I feel like 5.5 would be the lowest that I would look at today, and probably higher because of expectations for what's coming in the future. That starts to mean that maybe condo projects look more appealing, because now this apartment deal just isn't penciling, and now I got to do condos. So this might push it further in that direction. So just want to point out these things to be careful of.
Okay.
One more thing, and in terms of the bigger picture, is how else could affordable housing be delivered? There is the enhanced infrastructure finance district concept that I don't think the city has looked at in any degree. We have increased property taxes that would support bonds that could be issued to do affordable housing within that program. And then finally, yeah, I think the unbundling and the using of the existing parking resources that the city owns is a great idea. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay, Keith Rivera to be followed by Eve Sanford.
Thank you, Mr. White. I just wanted to address the impact of increasing the parking requirement for two-bedroom units in the medium-high density range to 1.5 from currently 1. So here's a current AUD project, 15,000 square foot lot, 26 units per acre, 9 two-bedroom, two-bath units, about 885 square feet each, 9 surface parking spaces, 9 bike spaces and lockers. Currently, you have 32% open space. Everybody has on-grade private open space. All the buildings are only 2 stories. They're single-family scale related to the context in the medium-high zone. So what happens if you go to 1.5 spaces per unit? You lose 3 units. And what the developer is going to do is he's going to only have 6 units that are going to become larger, less affordable units. Or you start to eat into the open space to make room for cars. And then what that's going to do is increase the mass, bulk, and scale of the project. So I think increasing the parking requirement for the 2 bedrooms is counter to providing additional housing. It's also counterproductive for neighborhood compatibility in these medium-high zones.
Okay. Thank you. Eve Sanford to be followed by Lucas Zucker.
Hi, Eve Sanford with the Santa Barbara Bicycle Coalition, SB Bike. I'm here to speak in support of the $30 affordable housing impact fee, the 15% inclusionary housing requirement, and the $20,000 parking in lieu fee for the priority housing overlay zone, both inside and outside of the CBD. If you look through the feasibility study, you can see that the return on cost for developers is always higher with the parking in lieu fees, regardless of if you're setting it at 10, 15, or 20,000. It still saves the developer money in the end because they're not paying the sort of $30,000 to $50,000 cost that building parking space would otherwise cost. In addition, it gives the designer more flexibility and would provide multimodal benefits and modernize our parking structures so that way these units could utilize our downtown parking. I'd like to speak a little bit on the recommendation to increase the parking, the amount of required parking. It's like the speaker before me said, and the report itself shows, these we're sort of at a decision point where we can either build more parking, require more parking of these units, or charge a higher affordable housing impact fee. And ultimately, I think as a city, and perhaps this discussion is a broader discussion that we need to have outside of this room, perhaps at an evening meeting. But I think as a city, we need to weigh those options and decide which of those values are more important to us, whether it's going in the direction of providing affordable housing or increasing our parking minimums on projects that are pretty transit accessible and downtown within the scope of the AUD program. So I'd like to see that conversation happen, perhaps as part of a stakeholder committee or perhaps as a separate meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. So Lucas Zucker followed by Brian Cornell.
Good afternoon. Given the severity of Santa Barbara's affordable housing crisis, CAUSE really urges the Housing Task Force to pursue a 15% inclusionary housing requirement or a $30 in lieu fee. We'd also support a $20 or $20,000 parking in lieu fee. We know that Santa Barbara faces a lot of the same challenges as cities across the state, but given extremely high land values, worldwide desirability, a built-out city and a kind of a low-wage tourism-based economy, we think the need is really great here for affordable housing, with over 7,000 families right now on our Housing Authority waiting list. That's 10 to 12 years long. Kaiser Martin's really detailed analysis actually shows that housing projects continue to be feasible with up to a 15% inclusionary housing requirement or a $30 fee. Santa Barbara currently already requires 15% on for-sale developments, and that's a number that's fairly typical in cities across the state. Ventura does 15% as well. In fact, AB 1505, the new bill this year that allowed inclusionary housing, specifically spells out 15% as the threshold where cities wouldn't have to, provide some extra justification to go beyond that. In terms of the dollar in lieu fee, Santa Monica, which I think is the best comparison city to Santa Barbara, in the examples provided by Kaiser Marston and their examples there, charges over $30 per square foot as an impact fee. And much like Santa Barbara, Santa Monica is an extremely desirable coastal city, which has continued to see strong economic development despite that robust affordable housing fee. I'd also like to say that the increasing the parking ratio from 1 to 1.5 really does mess up our ability to allow more affordable housing, and I'd really urge us to prioritize people over cars in that scenario. I also would really point to that in the scenario where we are allowing that kind of high density priority housing overlay in the CBD and an in lieu fee, even an in lieu fee for parking of up to 20,000, you still see all of the projects able to pencil out. So I think in the type of projects that we're really looking for in AUD, which is dense housing on the State Street corridor, we can absolutely require this level of affordable housing. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Brian Cornell, to be followed by Melissa Turner.
My head is spinning a little bit, I confess. I want to be sure. Number one, I want to be sure on the methodology, and I have not drilled down on this at length. But if we're saying the construction of 100 units creates a demand of 18 plus 7 or 25, a quarter of those units, I'm not sure how we got there, and maybe I can talk with you later, but the concern is that we can't assume that all 100 units get new residents. There's obviously a great demand for these units, and there are a lot of people that are doubling up. There's a lot of people that are living here with their parents. Whatever it is, I just want to be sure that wherever that we're really sure about what that number is. I also want to be sure that we're factoring in the real construction costs and land cost in Santa Barbara, because that's a very real thing. The AIA did this charrette last weekend, or 2 weekends ago, whenever it was, and we did conclude clearly that we need to create incentives in the downtown for housing. So I like the direction that this is going. I think that we do need to do that. We had some discussion at this charrette that we got from Radius Group, and it was interesting because they cautioned us, listen, these properties downtown, they're doing really well right now, and there's no incentive for a property owner to disrupt his property and stop the flow of rent and build units and go through the risk of the process to build these units. So we are going to have to figure out how to create incentives. Fundamentally, ultimately, I like the idea that we get more affordable housing, and if we can do that carefully and strategically, then that is a good thing. And I think a lot of the ideas here are very good, with the exception of increasing that parking ratio to 1.5. Just very quickly reading, looking at these things, I already talked about increasing the density, and I think we should look at the priority housing overlay or something near there. The parking in lieu fees, it's very important for us to think about where that money is going. Rob Dayton explained, at least one idea, but there's potentially a fairly large amount of income that could come from that we really ought to be working on relative to this. And then, finally, the phasing in of this is going to be important too, because I agree with Greg Reese that we have to be very careful that we don't kill this goose and suddenly find that we're not building housing anymore. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, and the last speaker will be Melissa Turner.
Hi, Melissa Turner. I'm one of the senior project managers at DesignArc, designer for the MARC as well. A couple of things I want to talk about. First question I had was how did the 1.5 space per 2-bedroom come about? Was the size of the unit, the tenants of the unit taken into account before taking that direction? We're working with developers who are finding ways or looking for ways to de-incentivize parking for our projects, and I find that the increase in the requirement for 2 bedrooms is very challenging for us to meet. We're already having difficulty meeting the current requirements at 1 per unit in the CBD. Stackers are great. We're doing it on 3 of our projects, but the problem is it increases the height of the building because you need a 15-foot clearance to fit 2 cars stacked up high, or you need to dig out a pit that's 10 foot deep, which adds cost to excavation and shoring. The cost per stalls are still pretty significant compared to traditional parking versus stacked. There's not a very big difference. Increasing the parking ratio would only make that worse. If you increase the parking ratio, other things also increase. For example, your ADA ratios might go up and you have to provide more ADA accessible stalls. You may have to increase your electrical vehicle charging stations and the accessible paths that are required. It just continues to erode into the project, whether it be for commercial or residential units. I highly recommend that be revisited. The other comment I wanted to point out was the higher density in the downtown, especially on State Street, would be great, but most likely we'd never be able to achieve the maximum density allowed. We currently already having very much trouble achieving a 4-story that would give us the maximum density on a parcel. We have projects that perhaps might be leaving several thousands of square foot off the table, off their performance, that they cannot even generate because it's so challenging to meet the neighborhood compatibility. So stackers are great, but increases the building height, increases the mass size, bulk, and scale. We can't even get that approved at a HLC or ABR. Project loses already quite a bit of their bottom line.
Okay.
So
Great.
just to, make that note, it's already very difficult with the current requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, there were some more slips which were over in staff's hands, so we do have some more speakers. Kathy McCammon to be followed by Mickey Flax.
Yes, I'm Kathy McCammon, and I guess now I have actually more questions than answers. First of all, on the percentage of affordable housing, does the 10% have to be fixed? Because we've heard talk about 15, but could it be lower? Then on parking in the central business district and outside, it seems that there would be an overlap of users. You're taking something that was built for customers and, as was pointed out, paid for as either mitigation or paid for by the businesses, and then you're going to take this public parking and turn it into a private use. And I know that you talk about the spaces being empty in the evening, but there was also mention you encourage people to move around and get out because it will cost them more if they live there to stay there in the daytime. So it seems like a lot of this still needs to be discussed and thought out and figure out exactly where those spaces are and what you will do for alternatives for people that need to park. And maybe they work part-time, so they need to have their car somewhere. Maybe it doesn't even have to be there, right there on site. And then the other thing is for people that want to live in the central business district, have you given any thought to making people sign a contract that they don't have a car, so they don't need parking? So those are just a few of the questions I've got now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mickey Flax to be followed by Joanna Kaufman.
Good afternoon. Your illuminating report, as I understand the report, the following was found. The feasibility of developers, private developers, building more affordable housing depends on higher density, lower parking requirements, unbundling parking or no parking at all in the future, and the still and continuing need for some sort of subsidy, either from other units or from some other source, for genuinely low and very low income families. Quelle surprise. Was there anything in there or anything in the report that we didn't already know? I don't think so. There may be, comparisons of 10,000 feet or 20,000 feet or whatever, but basically everything that we have learned, we learned a long time ago, and we knew. The future of the AUD or any other program that strives to build workforce and affordable housing will depend on political will, which reflects the strength of the city's commitment to housing our workforce. That's what it depends on. Where there is a will, there is a way. Where there is no will, 87 different ways won't be enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Joanna Kaufman to be followed by Anna Marie Gott.
Hi, thank you, task force members. I think as the consultant mentioned that the future is no parking. So I believe that we should take this opportunity to even just catch up to now, which is a lot of jurisdictions are already implementing some of these policies, specifically supporting the $20,000 per space in lieu fee, and seeing, for example, the city of Santa Monica uses these fees to support the goals of their transportation element. So we should also use this funding to go towards creating more opportunities for multimodal transportation in the city of Santa Barbara and supporting multimodal transportation. And also we should do whatever or use whatever incentives we can to redirect development to be happening in the central areas of the city, so more people will be walking and biking and taking transit. I also do not support the 1.5 parking space requirement. I think that's taking a step in the wrong direction and is saying Santa Barbara wants to continue to have car-oriented development, which I think the future, once again, is going to be no parking. So we should start thinking in that way.
Great, thank you. Anna Marie Gott to be followed by the last speaker, Joe Rushin.
Actually, Joe's given me his minutes. Chair and board members, the first thing I just want to remind everyone of one of the last comments that we had here today, and a question was, is the AUD dead? And I think the AUD is dead as we know it. And I want to point out that in September, you had a vote. The vote was 4-2. The motion was made by our new mayor-elect, Kathy Murillo. And that motion was to actually exclude every single AUD project in the pipeline from the cap that the city council actually passed in August. We are not going to get affordable housing out of the current AUD. That program does need to be capped. We need to start a new one that actually ensures that we are going to have the in lieu fees, that we are going to have units set aside for those with lower incomes. The feasibility study illustrated what we already know. We knew that for every 100 units built of market rate housing, a certain number of units were going to be demanded for lower income workers. We knew that, but no one actually decided to do a feasibility study years ago, and one should have been done years ago. We're trying to catch up. And I think that this board needs to relook at that vote right now in terms of what you guys decided. And let me just say that Councilmember Dominguez was absent, Councilmember Bendy White voted against it, and Commissioner Sheila Lodge voted against it. But the rest of the people on this board voted to try to undo the cap. And that was going to ensure that all of the units moving forward, when they are built, will not be part of that cap with the I can't remember what it's called right at the moment, but it is actually the cap with the ability to rank all of the units and base it on affordability and compatibility with our neighborhoods. And affordability was the number one issue that people are concerned about. So I think you guys need to retake that vote and rethink that motion and rethink what you guys are doing here. But more importantly, I just do want to say I am in support of the in lieu fees. I am in support of making sure that we have a certain number of units that are going to be set aside for our moderate and middle income earners. I do question the use of our parking garages at night. I do question that primarily because what happens when you unbundle, in some cases, you know, the apartments with the parking, and then we don't have a nighttime parking or parking program. If you don't have a nighttime parking program, people might not necessarily want to pay for the parking structure, you know, for the use of that parking structure at night. So where is it going to go? It's going to go out into the neighborhoods. And we also know from a study that was released over the summer that Uber and Lyft are not reducing car ownership right now. We do know that it's actually increasing the trips driven. So we keep planning for this idea that we are not going to need cars. We have a terrible transportation system. It doesn't serve the population for where the work is and where the workforce lives. They are dependent upon vehicles. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Those things need to be revisited. But more importantly, I think that motion needs to be revisited from September the 13th. Right. That needs to be revised, in my opinion, because we just found out yet again that AUD is not going to produce what we are looking for. And we need to meter those out and get a brand new AUD 2.0 that is going to meet our needs. Thank you.
Thank you. We just keep getting more joy here. We have one more speaker, Mr. Gorin, just coming in late. Welcome.
Good study beforehand, though. Thanks for being here. Thanks. I'm glad that the city's looking into this. I know I'm kind of late to the party. I haven't been to lots of your previous meetings. I've been following it a little bit. And some people brought me up to speed on these assumptions for profit on these projects. And I'm a land use planner of Vanguard Planning. Prior to that, I was a principal in 3 different real estate development companies. And I would really like to see this downtown housing happen, but I'm concerned because the foundational assumption we have here for what profit is required to make a project feasible, it's too far off from the reality of doing development in Santa Barbara. It's possible that somebody might be doing projects for 5% net profit, which is basically what ROC is, in other markets where you don't have all of the uncertainty that you have here in terms of how long it takes to get a project approved, what are the design boards going to do to your original assumptions, what are the planning commission and council going to subsequently do to your project later, or are you going to get approved at all? So when I was a developer, for example, we wouldn't even look further at a project if it didn't demonstrate it was going to generate on line with about 16% net unlevered profit. And, 5, we just wouldn't even, I wouldn't call somebody back over 5%. In Santa Barbara, you almost need higher than that, although there's other factors here that make the project a little bit more certain. So that 5% is before we've applied any fees to it. And also there's the consultants talking about, historic low interest rates, right? Well, I mean, interest rates are not static. They're going to go up. Everybody expects them to go up. If they go up even a little bit, that 5% is going to become 3%. I mean, I want to see these projects get built. And for them to get built, a developer needs to decide that it's worth making an investment to build them. There's many other investments I could make and earn 5% without the insane amount of risk and brain damage and time that it takes to deliver a project like this. So the 3 variables we have to work with are, we have profit. If you dramatically increase the profit, you can make this work, but we don't want to do that. It makes housing less affordable. The other variable we have is risk and certainty. And if you can increase certainty, it makes it possible to do these projects for less profit and less net profit and still charge these fees. So as the city, we've got a lot of control over the certainty of these projects. And I would hope that we stick with what we agree to do here when people actually take the risk and invest in doing one of these projects.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Gorin. Okay, so that ends public comment. So it's back to the committee, and we have these task force questions, and we have 54 minutes for 7 of us, so that's 7 minutes. Mr. Rao? Go ahead and talk to us.
Possibly the best strategy would be to address all the affordable housing questions with one round and then another round on the parking.
Okay. Guide us through on that.
Okay, so we have 3 questions in front of us regarding affordable housing, and the consultant and staff are asking the task force, once you've looked at the draft studies, what is your recommendation on these particular questions? So I think the best process might be to just go around the table and provide your opinion and answer for each of those 3.
Okay, very good. So we started on Mr. Dominguez's end first, so now we'll start on Mr. Olson's end and launch into the questions 1, 2, and 3. And you don't have to answer them all. You just pick what you feel you like the best to answer.
Does the city wish to require on-site affordable units for rental projects?
Yes or no question?
Yes, I think so. Yes. And I think the 10-unit threshold is a good one to start with. I think the moderate income level is a good level to work with in terms of affordability. And I think the in lieu housing fee makes sense. And the for small projects especially, and the fractional units using the same different level fee levels. I don't know about the CBD though. I think the CBD, we need to look at it differently than the other areas.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, may I interject with just one point for all of the task force members to consider when considering these questions about affordable housing on site or in lieu fees. When you're talking about affordable housing for rental projects, we're talking about AB 1505. And one of the requirements of AB 1505 basically has 2 requirements. One is capital A affordable, so Task Force Member Olson is in the moderate range. That's it. We're still within capital A affordable. We're not, so we don't want to be considering middle income or other higher levels. The other factor is you are required to, if you know the 15% limit. After 15%, HCD can start looking over your shoulder and deciding whether or not this is becoming an impediment to the development of the market rate housing. The last point that I would make is that you must have an in lieu fee mechanism in addition to any on-site requirement. So feel free to think about what would work as an on-site requirement, what targets to be putting there, but understand that you'll be required to have an in lieu fee that would be available at the election of the developer to as an out. So
Thank you.
Actually, I'd like to add a point of clarification to that. It actually, I believe it actually states that an in lieu fee is an option, that there's other options that can be provided called an alternative method of compliance. You don't necessarily have to give an in lieu fee as an option. You can provide other forms of compliance, such as the purchase of off-site land or rehabilitation of existing affordable housing.
you have to provide any one of those.
Right, any one of those. Okay.
You have to provide at least one offsite.
Correct.
One option.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So, Mr. and that means you're done now, Mr. Olson, with that? Great, thank you. Mr. Campanella?
I'm going to give my opinion, but I want to give it with a caveat that I think that whatever we come up with should go back to the force that Reed got together to provide input in the first place, to get their input to what we're finally recommending before it goes further, and their input to be evaluated by staff prior to coming back to this group. I think we've heard comments, but I don't feel comfortable moving on without a double check of what we're coming up with. And but I am going to give my opinion, subject to hopefully an approval by a technical group reconvening. One of our missions for the purpose of the Housing Task Force was to explore options to assess impact fees or otherwise mandate the construction of rental housing affordable to household earning 80 to 120% of area median income. Okay, this is something outside the scope of the AUD program originally. It did not cover these income levels, but we're looking to make a modification to come up with either a program adjustment, or standalone, or working with the housing authorities, whatever, in order to try to accomplish this goal of providing this income level housing, whatever creative way we can come up with it. And today we're entertaining a fee. So the 10% fee the affordable for rental projects, I agree with. 10% for the moment I agree with as workable without seeing the numbers that or comments of the actual practitioners. I would set the threshold at 10. I think City of San Jose Reed sets it at 20. Is that correct? For example?
I think that's right.
Okay. So 10 and 10%, I feel is okay. I would not round up and down, because when you're dealing with a 10-unit project, at some point you're going to be having 20% or more affordable. And that since we're not doing any additional units other than the ones there, I would say that you would proportionately charge fees based on the whole unit. If the builder did not want to pay the fee and give you another affordable unit, leave that up to the discretion of the builder. But I would not round up and down, because it could be punitive to a project, let's say with 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 units. You're now higher than 10%. You're approaching 20%. Okay? And then for small projects, below 10, I say no. They have enough difficulty getting off the ground, and I would leave them without the fee for affordable housing due to economics of all the other costs they have to absorb to get the project off the ground with a much smaller number of units and relatively higher per unit cost than the projects with over 10 units. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. Yes to requiring on-site affordable units for rental projects. And what you're recommending was 10% at moderate income, right? And we put a lot of store in your report, so I'm generally supporting what you're proposing on this affordable housing issue. On-site affordable requirement, yes. And I thought the round up or round down, that could translate into fees, right? So that seemed like a good idea, though I'm appreciating what Commissioner Campanella is saying and running it past your technical advisory committee. And yes, a housing fee for smaller projects, again, with review by your group. And the $20 per square foot, that was related to number 2 or number 3? Okay. Okay. So I support that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to thank Ms. Gott for reminding us of the action that was taken previously. So I couldn't remember why I'd made the statement last time about I wasn't sure it was worth all the effort. There are so few projects that are going to be covered by this because of what was done in determining where the cutoff point would be. In any event, yes, I certainly do want to require on-site affordable units, and the 10% percentage seems to work, and the moderate income, the 80 to 120% level is appropriate. The on-site threshold, setting the threshold at 10 units is okay, and I think the roundup factor should be applied since, as Councilmember Murillo pointed out, that can be applied in a monetary, it would be applied in a monetary way. And yes, I think that the city should adopt a housing fee for small projects and fractional units. And the amount that was recommended, was it the 20,000? I think we need to, setting different fee levels for different projects, such as in the CBD. We seem to have a lot of unanswered questions about that area.
About the CBD.
The CBD, yeah.
Great.
So.
Thank you. Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can answer yes to all three of those, but I got so many caveats, I'm not really sure they're yeses when I'm done with them. So Mr. Cornell didn't really answer my question, and Mr. Gorin didn't hear my question, but he came in and answered my question. I still have great concern with the little flexible scale of 5 to 5.5% return on cost being what developers are willing to undertake in this city. And if that's wrong, that just stops the whole rest of the process on paper that you're presenting. So what's clear to me is whatever comes about as a result of this discussion and ends up getting adopted at council will be another exercise that demands close attention in an adaptive management program. Close watch of it, nimble responses as it's ongoing to make sure that you're getting what you want from the assumptions that you made. I have concerns also with Mr. Rietz's comments on if we drive people away from apartments into condos. My experience with condos, even when an inclusionary affordable component was included, is that they're just not feasible. An example would be the one next to the Arlington that had units. A new school teacher that earns $65,000 or $70,000 at San Marcos qualifies and gets in there, but then can't afford the HOA fees. And so the condo basically sits there waiting for somebody who has some artificial form of support from parents or other means that is not part of their income. And so it reduces, it negates what the goal was. And then I have concerns with just the use of fees, especially as in our history. We've collected fees, but I don't know that we've been very effective about using those fees to do anything that was tangible based on the burden we put on the project. In response to Mr. Gorin's certainty comment too, I think this the discussion here certainly plays over next month into the discussion on ranking and how we apply ranking and offer certainty to a development in that ranking process that complements or goes along with the burdens that we're going to put on it today
in terms of, or that we would put on it in terms of fees or inclusionary units. So I said 3 yeses, and if you could accomplish all that, I think the percentage of affordable units, I would like to see at the largest percentage that we can justify per law. And for the threshold of 10, that sounds pretty good, the way it's written there. And then for fees, also the largest fee that we could apply that's justifiable by law. And that would be with the caveat that the rest of the problems need to be addressed too, the uncertainties, the return, if that assumption is correct, and then the certainty of somebody entering into that project with those known things and not getting hijacked through time and money just to get their project on the ground. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Dominguez?
So I'll follow in my neighbor's precedent here and say yes, 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 and move on to the details because that's where the devil lurks. I think there will need to be more conversations with our community. This is a pretty wholesale change of our housing situation. The AUD has failed. If your goal is to build workforce housing, we're actually reducing the number of units, and that's why I had our representative here explain in details the numbers. And for every 100 units of market-based rentals we build, the study shows that requires 25 more households. And I believe the chart showed 45 more workers will then have jobs in Santa Barbara for every 100 units. And since we're not building that affordable housing, we're increasing the demand, and then we're actually losing some units either because of short-term rentals or because we're demolishing below market rate units to make way for market rate units. So either way, the program's not producing the desired results. Maybe the community's changed its mind and wants a different result, but I haven't heard that yet either. So in a truth in advertising, we should either work and reverse our policy to meet the original goals or admit that we're not trying. So my preference is to try to reach those original goals by engaging in this process. It's unfortunate. We started a year ago, May, Councilmember White and I had an agenda memo to get affordable impact fees on council. So it's taken 16 months. My fear is it's going to take another year to really get this going. And in the meantime, all these opportunities to have this affordable housing built will dissipate. So I would like to make a motion that we send this to City Council for further direction. The devil's in the details, and I think we need council to either direct this body to take it up and get into those details, or Planning Commission, or the council itself. But it seems like we've come quite a ways, and it's time for a reconnect with council for further direction. So I would make the motion and see if there's a second that we send this to council and have staff bring this to council and get further direction.
Mr. Chair, when you say this, just what do you mean by this?
This study
The whole study without...
and the city's staff's recommendations.
Not being there next year, I'm going to let others take that step. And I also haven't made my comments yet, so.
Is
But
there a
doesn't seem to be
second or
for
not?
the motion at this point. What's that?
I'm just asking if there's a second. That was a motion.
Yes, we hear. I got it. There was
Okay.
a motion. I haven't heard a second yet. So then I'm going to.
I think that's premature, Frank.
Okay, so I'm going to proceed with my comments then at this point. I guess the triple yes is there. Maximum fees, maximum requirements on units. In my view, this sort of round up, round down. I'm picturing if it's a that the fraction would be commensurate with if you have a 3/10 of a project, then you pay 3/10 of a unit. You pay a fee on 3/10 of a unit, not rounded, not either lose that fee altogether. Just since it can be money, just make it commensurate with how many units are being proposed. Also, I want to back up and just make sure that that I'm understanding what we're doing here. this study is required in order for us to provide the inclusionary rental requirement. Is that not right?
The portion of the study that is required is the Nexus study for purposes of adopting an impact fee.
Okay.
It's not required for the inclusionary housing portion of it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So in order to go with the impact fee. All right. Thank you. Okay. So, and then as far as how we manage this going forward, I've led off every other meeting with we revert to a variable density ordinance unless we can come up with something new after we've built the 200 units. So that's what we're trying to avoid, is that reverting to the variable density ordinance, which takes out all of these high density options, go off the table. So that's the impetus for creative thinking and collaborating as this effort goes forward. Okay, so now motions on. Sure, Ms. Maria.
Thanks. Just a clarification question for Mr. Kawahara. Mr. Cornell said that we do have families with multi-generational people living in them, and so it goes to the question of how much are we really creating every new unit, the 100 units, creating 25 extra affordable housing units, and where are they coming from, and people are doubled up and tripled up, actually, especially at that income range where they are service workers, hotels, restaurants. So that would be my question. And I've mentioned that before in these meetings, that Santa Barbara has overcrowding, and I would imagine if there's a new unit, there would be some movement within the community. Thanks.
Yeah, I recall that question coming up actually back in July when I was here before. So here's the thing about overcrowding, and it's certainly true that overcrowding is occurring here in the city, and that potentially there could be some opportunities for folks that are in overcrowded situations today to move into, the new AUD units. I think if that's kind of the question.
But also there won't be new service workers coming from outside. They're here and they're living. They're okay living overcrowded. That's what we do here. So I'm just saying that's a possibility.
So you're also asking to what degree the jobs that are being created can be fulfilled by people who are already here in overcrowded situations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly possible. We did not assume in the Nexus study analysis that the jobs that the new housing demand that's created for these lower income households would be satisfied in an overcrowded housing situation. We assumed that they would be provided in a standard, apartment development in which, you don't have an overcrowded situation. So, for example, we know that the city partners with the Housing Authority, for example, and with other nonprofits in town to build 100% affordable projects with tax credits, for example. And so that is how we assume that the housing would be provided for these lower income households rather than in possibly an overcrowded situation.
I do. I like that scenario too. A perfect world. Everyone has a place to live. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, actually, David is reminding me as well that the Nexus study itself does have a factor in it that tries to account for the fact that there are some workers already here in the city of Santa Barbara that could take those jobs that are created by the new market rate units. So it does try to account for that possibility with some data behind it. But so yes, we tried to recognize that.
Thank you.
Mr. Jordan.
So you confused me by that. You confused me by the question, and then I don't think answered. So let me just be more blunt. I think what's out there right now is excess people living in a market rate unit that would have an option. There's 8 people living in a unit that there shouldn't be 8 people in. They're in a market rate unit, regardless of what they earn, and they would have an opportunity to then see another unit that they could move into, and those type of moves are not generating new low-income wage worker demand because they're all, the 8 people are already here going to the grocery store, going to the dry cleaner, going wherever they're going. So to me, that question was, does your study reflect that we have a lot of those, we have more so than your usual baseline would be, that type of thing. I have, nobody wants to know my life, but I have, right? So, okay, so we have in my house currently, my wife and I, 2 grown daughters with their husbands living with us, a grandkid, and 2 20-year-olds in the house. Okay,
And that's a 1-bedroom apartment, isn't it?
You've been there. You know that's not true. I have a big house problem, but all of those people live there because they can't find affordable housing for their level of wages in this town. But they are already using the services of whatever you want to call the service workers out in town. So if they had a place to move in town, they wouldn't be generating new burdens of low income wage service providers, right? You follow what I'm saying? Yeah. And to an extent of Santa Barbara, how much does that exist and not reflected in your report? I guess that's my question that I thought was Kathy's question.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, let me just say one thing right up front, which is that, the Nexus study itself, we sort of, at Kaiser Marston in my office, we sort of tag team this effort. So my partner, David, in the office really was in charge of the Nexus study and knows the Nexus study in and out with all the details behind it. And some of the questions that we're now discussing are a little bit beyond my ability to answer completely. So I would prefer that for some of those questions that I asked David to address those more specifically, if we could do that, rather than give you an incorrect answer.
Okay.
The one thing I would add to this whole analysis, if you recall, the Nexus study provides a level where it would present 100% mitigation for the effect of service workers. And if you remember, that was in the range of about a $63 a square foot figure. So even if you were to factor in, say, half of those, the error is 50%, you still are basically creating a maximum fee, which we're not recommending charging. Yes.
Okay, so we have now had a round of comment on the affordability issues, and what is the pleasure of the task force? We've had one motion without a second. Do we have any other staff recommendations on this of what we should do, or any thoughts by committee members? Anything on your part, Mr. Rao?
Possibly in the interest of time, we could move on to the next round of questions, if given we have.
Do nothing with these, you're saying?
No, I'm not recommending that.
Okay, all right.
I think George would like to make a comment.
Mr. Chair, members of the task force, George Buell, Community Development Director. As you've done in previous meetings, will be very helpful here today in terms of there are questions that are being asked by staff, and direction is needed for us in order to know what the pleasure of the task force is. And so if you would please make motions, work through these, and if you have anything else that you'd like to add, we can do that. But right now it's ambiguous, and we want to make sure that we're on the same page and we're communicating to the City Council what your recommendations are.
Very
good. I realize that we're getting pushed up against time, but we really need that clear direction.
All right. Well, what we do then today, we're going to do clearly, even if we don't do it all, and then we can, if we need to continue this to next week or whenever staff can fit it in, then we can do that.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So motions on item. Let's do it one question at a time. On item 1, does the city wish to require on-site affordable units for rental projects? I think did I hear that was a yes all the way around the table?
Well, I'm going to, when we get to, as far as agreeing to what's the particular points on, I've given my comments, but I am not going to vote for moving it on. I'm going to vote for having staff review it with practitioners, get their input on what we're deciding, and come back to us to review, because this thick document just came out, and we want to make sure that it works. In principle is one thing, and actual implementation and the impact it has, we don't know, because we're not out there doing the projects. Reed's made some good calculated assumptions, but I think it needs to be validated by the people out there, and we have to give them an opportunity before we move on.
Okay, thank
Mr.
you.
Chair.
Ms. Lodge?
I'm a little perplexed by your statement, Commissioner Campanella, because the consultants did consult with local developers. This has been reviewed with them. I mean, that was the whole point of it. So it seems to me unnecessary to redo that.
Well, in response, they did consult. I was at a session where they did talk to them, but the finalization of what's here, including our famous 1.5 parking, was not reviewed.
We haven't done parking.
Yeah,
we're
No,
done-
I understand, but as far as the idea that he has reviewed it, he got input. But what we're recommending today as a package has not been reviewed by the practitioners in the community. Am I correct?
Yes, it's correct. And just to clarify, the outreach meeting that we participated in with the developers and other practitioners was at a somewhat high level. And we didn't have pro formas developed at that time, and we didn't run through all of the assumptions. And so we did get some input. And again, as I indicated, we did have some follow-up phone calls afterward. But as far as them reviewing the complete study and the complete recommendations, I can't say whether that's been done by the developers group.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So, we have any motions on item 1?
I'll make. Oh,
It
I'm
sounds
sorry.
like we sound like we had consensus on to require on-site affordable units for rental projects, and that percentage was 10. Was that 10?
10% at the moderate level.
At the moderate,
80 to 120.
right.
80
At
to
the
120.
moderate, right.
I'll move that, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to support the 10% and at the moderate.
And I am moving that with Mr. Campanella's concern that it goes back to the technical advisory group.
Could you maybe spell that out a little bit more? Because I have the same concern of being pushed into a yes or no response on this, because I had a bunch of caveats too with whether the underlying formulas still make sense, and I think my response was to the maximum allowable that we could justify. And I think yours was too.
Yep.
So, I mean, the more we talk about a yes or no vote on each one of these, the more I'm leaning to the guy at the left that would be we need some more direction maybe. So.
Then let me modify and see if the seconder would go for it. So the motion is to require. The motion is to send to the technical group a requirement of on-site affordable units for rental projects at least 10% at the moderate income level, and consideration for a higher percentage.
And they would look at it, and then they come back to us to.
We would get a report back from that group.
Would that be the only item that they would be looking at?
Well, presumably, they were going to go through the whole list here, and the package would be sent.
Well,
I think that we should be looking at the whole package before it goes to the technical group.
Okay. So we have we have a straw vote perhaps on this, and then see how we develop the whole package, and then once we get the whole package, we send the package?
Yes.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So we have a motion. Did the seconder agree to the
Okay.
changes? Okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So there's a second, to send this to the technical committee. Jordan?
So I'd just ask that if you could just add a line in there for, since I agree with coming back and a report out, but if there would be an additional report out on the feasibility of the return on cost numbers again. A review of those again. So I'm still uncomfortable with saying 10% or better than 10%, but if you're the credibility of this return on cost is already a question, then it doesn't really matter. So it dooms the whole process. So I would like to see if we could just have that looked at again, and as part of the return on that item, also hear back from the consultant.
Okay, I'll incorporate that if Ms. Lodge will.
So I'm confused about what Commissioner Jordan expects to come from that process. If there's a stakeholder group that is going to protest, so to speak, the study and submit documentation that counters maybe some of the assumptions, I think they should start on that now, and we fully support that, and we can create a process if there needs to be a process. But having the consultant just rewrite in different words what they've already done, I'm not sure how that.
Well, I don't have a good feeling that that number has been vetted locally to the extent that it should be.
So you're saying they should go get approval from the people who this harms, that this is a good idea. We're going to limit your profit,
be one way of putting
and
it.
they're going to rubber stamp that.
No,
It just doesn't seem likely that they're going to say we're willing to give up 15% of our units.
Okay, I would say that what we have here is, Mr. Jordan has expressed skepticism about the return on cost, whatever we're calling that. That's not part of the motion here. And what we're doing is a straw vote on. We're going to go through and do 3 straw votes on these individual pieces per Mr. Olson's comments, so that we have an ecosystem at the end of this, a package that we hopefully will agree on.
The straw vote seems redundant if everyone's made their comments on the 3 questions. Mr. Buell asked for input. We've all given input. I'm not sure why spending a lot of time on a vote is going to inform the people who are implementing our comments any more than the comments that are already out there now.
Mr. Buell has asked for motions, so I'm going to honor that. So we have.
I think he actually asked for input, not motions, but if he wants to clarify exactly what he needs, that might help us expedite the last 15 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Dominguez, I did ask for motions. The intent is to get clear direction for staff so that we know what the pleasure of the task force is, so that we can communicate that back to the council.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we have that. We have a motion. Thank you, Mr. Buell. I think we got the motion. I have motions. We have one, and I'm using some tool to get the package together per Mr. Olson's preference. So we have one piece of the puzzle here with a motion and a second, and then we will move on to items 2 and 3. So that's and then all together, no trick plays here. We're all in this together to try and get a package back to our staff and to the technical committee. So we have a motion on the floor on item 1, and the motion is, one last time.
To require on-site affordable units for rental projects at 10% or better at the moderate income level, and a review by the stakeholders group.
Right. Okay. All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No, I think I would not vote for or better, but I think it should be the recommendation of the 10% by the consultant. That's why I'm voting no.
I'm going to vote no, because even if we come up with these numbers, give it to a group to study, and they approve it and it goes to council and they say, well, we want 12.5 instead of 10, then we're going to start the process. To me, it just seems like it's dilatory and it's going to really push things back. Until we have a number that the community's agreed on, it doesn't make a lot of sense to study things piecemeal and then have to start over if the decision makers change their mind. So this process here doesn't seem like it's been truly thought out in terms of getting something expedited to a system that's failing our community.
I mean, aren't we trying to improve the system, Mr. Dominguez? So we're working with the practitioners, the people who will give us the housing, and we're giving them direction on what to give us.
Okay, we're getting
Right, I just don't want them to
away
hijack it, the process.
All right, we have now item 2, on-site threshold. For an on-site affordable requirement, does the city wish to set the threshold at 10 units or something different? And does the city wish to apply a round up-down factor at 0.5? Do we have any motions on this?
I move that this. Oh.
Go ahead.
I move that the city set the threshold at 10 units and to provide a round-up down factor at 0.5.
Okay, so there's a motion. Is there a second to that?
Did we also talk about not losing the incremental decimal point and making sure that then moved over to a fee? Does that need to be part of this motion?
This would be fee because it's 10 units or less.
And then do we recapture the 0.3 of the 1.3 as in the fee, or do we just round it down? This is setting a unit, not a fee. So I think we had a conversation about setting a threshold of units and a percentage, and if it was not a whole number but less than 0.5, then applying that decimal to a fee. So you got a unit plus a fee. Did we not have that conversation?
That's my understanding.
Okay. So
But I thought this was applying at where it is 10 units or less, the fee part.
We're setting the threshold at 10.
Yeah.
So that's one.
Okay.
And then the up-down factor at 0.5 is, this is what Mr. Jordan was referring to, there will be, the proposal is that fraction would be translated into a fee that's equivalent to the fraction.
Oh, okay. And so if there are 13 units, well.
Then it would be 1 unit plus
the,
3/10, and that would be at whatever the mitigation fee is.
Should
then
apply.
it would be that 3/10 portion.
Yes, I would include that in the motion.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chair, is there a second? I'm sorry.
I'll second that.
Okay, but this also has the preamble as our first, that it goes to the technical group, correct?
You know, it seems to me like, you know, why did the city pay all this money to the consultants to provide this report where they've looked at this all, and it looks to me, and I'm beginning to agree with Councilmember Dominguez, that it's unnecessary and it's just going to take more time. And so what if they disagree? And what if they disagree with the report? So I would not want to include that.
So my understanding is that the technical committee, that there would be, it can go both places, right? It can go to council for review, and it can go to the technical committee, and it can be providing feedback to council as well when the council discusses it. Does that not make sense?
Well, I guess that would make sense if it were not. It seems to be an unnecessary
Staff, what do you think?
step.
That seems reasonable. The only comment I'd like to make is that we have a consultant here that's done this for many cities, and the return on equity and return on cost analysis is blended. And I'm not sure there's a full understanding of return on equity as it relates to the profitability of a developer. We have over 60 projects being built, in this zone of return on cost. So that is the feasibility level. And by taking it back to another technical committee, I think if that technical committee is looking to enhance the profitability of the project, they will have a certain outcome. And when we did our feedback through our groups, we had different stakeholders involved. Some of them were advocates of more affordable housing, and they weren't developers. And I'm not sure we would get necessarily a completely objective opinion from this technical group.
Clearly not. But we would get what I'm hearing from Mr. Campanella is this report has not been vetted with that group, so that this was at least be the opportunity for a closer look by that group, and that while this, and I agree with Mr. And now I think, again, the fog parts a little bit with Mr. Dominguez's concept of this needs to get moved forward to council. And but there can be a bypass route that gets the opportunity for more feedback from the folks, because there hasn't been a full vetting of this report at that level at this time. Is that a fair?
Mr. Chair, may I make one more comment? It has to do with the question about the returns, and I think it's important when we talk about the returns, because obviously.
I'd like to get back to this process I'm talking about. The returns is an issue. I appreciate that, but we're trying to get agreement as a group on how to move this forward, whether it has to do with the return on cost and these other items. But just as I say, this notion of okay, this information needs to go to council, and it also, because it hasn't been fully vetted yet with this technical group, they would have a chance to have their comments on this that would be added to the council review of this item.
Yeah, thus it is a draft. That's correct, and there is opportunity to fully comment. This isn't a final report,
Right.
so that makes sense.
Okay. Whew. All right. I think that's a fair. At least it seems to me there's fairness in this. That there's transparency. And yet it's moving forward at the same time. It's getting back to council, and there's going to be feedback from the technical committee as well. So that would apply to, of course, again, we had the straw poll on item number 1. Now we've set up number 2 for that process. And we have a motion and a second, right? Okay. Bear with me. Who made the motion?
I made the motion.
Ms. Lodge and?
But without the referral to a technical committee.
Okay. Are you okay with that? At least, they just have their comment. They have their opportunity to comment, but it goes to council. It's heading to council no matter what they say.
Okay.
I think it's a reasonable compromise. Okay. So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The glory of unanimity. Yay. Okay. Yes. Okay. Now, number 3. In lieu housing fee. Does the city wish to adopt a housing fee for small projects and fractional units? And if so, how much? And I think that the answer that generally was yes. And then is it to the maximum that is allowed by law? That was what I heard. At least I was saying that. I think Mr. Jordan might have said that. Is that how others feel? Or is there... Can we get
The recommendation was for what?
The $20 a square foot, I think.
Yeah. But you're suggesting that it might be possible to go higher than that? Is that the?
I'm game to go with the 20, just in the name of getting half of this done in the full amount of time.
Mr. Chair, we do have it's an impact fee study. Okay, so we have a basis right now. Everything that the consultant has come up with has a basis, in fact, he feels, having done them for the mitigation fees, that it's supportable. Okay, so we're going to verify it to see if it should be something else on a different pathway with comments. I don't think we should be saying to the maximum extent permitted by law. I don't know what that means. I don't even know if it's legal. I mean, in terms of.
That would be the, that
Yeah,
would be
but
the.
I don't know
That
what
would be
law.
illegal,
no,
right?
I don't think it's, yeah, well, what it is, it's an inconclusive loop, whatever that
Okay.
means.
Well, that
So
would
how do you
actually
make
be
the
the-
decision?
So the $20,
Yes.
well, okay, do we have a motion on this front at this point? Don't everybody speak at once.
I'll move that, Mr. Chair.
The $20 a square foot
Yes, sir.
for that piece, so the answer is yes, and $20 a square foot. And then we'll save the next question for the CBD, shall be its own kettle of fish. Okay, there's a motion to go with yes and $20 a square foot. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second on that. All right, any other discussion?
I'm going to vote no on this one because I was not in favor of applying the same type fee to a small project because of economics.
Okay.
Thank you.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay. Great. All right, now, on to the CBD. Is there anything, do we want to say anything about CBD at this point? My own contribution to that would be that it seems to me that this is a new project, relatively speaking. I mean, we want to take on CBD and we want it to work, and it's different than the rest of the city. So we're started, but we may want different fees. We certainly are talking about the communal parking as a piece of the puzzle. So it's going to be a different fee level for different projects. So perhaps the short answer is yes and to be determined.
Mr. Chair, if our policy is to move AUD projects out of the residential neighborhoods and into the downtown, then we could adopt incentives or something that feels like an incentive and not go for a fee there. Is that a possibility? Would that help bring some projects downtown? And again, for people concerned about the traditional residential neighborhoods.
Well, even the CBD is a topic of conversation for this task force. I don't remember whether it's the next time or the time after, but soon as a focus. Just how do we handle that? So the short answer would be: does the city wish to set different fee levels? Probably, or yes, or something to that effect. And then that would be that whole concept of CBD is going to be dealt with here in a focused way. So perhaps the cop-out could be yes for the moment, and then to be more discussion to occur at the CBD session, which will be by the task force.
Mr. Chair, if I may. Number 4 is parking ratios outside the CBD.
Okay, we're not on to parking. We're not on to 4 yet. We're doing the first 3.
Oh, okay.
And then we're going to have a
Oh, I
grand
see.
bargain
Different-
of these 3, and that's probably going to be the extent of what we do today. So the point would be the CBD piece is: does the city wish to set different fee levels for different projects such as CBD? And I would say the short answer is yes, and then more to be determined at CBD discussion by this group in 60 days, something like that.
Mr. Chair, I know that question is just asked in number 3, but it would really apply to 1, 2, and 3, would it not?
This whole thing is a...
No, I'm sorry. As far as a different fee level, there are on-site affordable, there's on-site threshold, and in lieu housing fee. So when we talk about CBD, if we wish to establish a different fee level, and I'll ask staff, doesn't that apply to all 3 items?
Potentially it could.
Okay. I just didn't want to be confused. We're just doing something different on in lieu.
True. Good point.
Is that okay? Thanks.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second for, again, bear with me. Who made the motion for item 3? Adopt the housing fee for small project and fractional units.
I think it was Lodge.
Lodge, and that's the $20.
Jordan, yeah.
Not on number 3.
It was Murillo and Dominguez.
Murillo and Dominguez. Thank you. Okay. All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay.
And that just because we're talking about really all three items, I think we're going to find other ways to incentivize the CBD. I think it's just as important to have affordable units in the downtown where there are many low-income workers as it is anywhere else. So how are you going to provide those if you don't apply these same criteria to those units? And I think we'll more than make up for incentives for the CBD somewhere else.
All right, so now we have the three different single pieces together. We've had strong support on all three individual components. So may we say that we are moving these three forward to council and the technical committee at this point?
You're talking about the parking items 4,
No,
5, and 6?
1, 2,
no.
and 3.
Oh, 1, 2, and 3, okay.
No, we're not. We haven't touched the parking.
Okay.
And we're not going to have time to touch the
Oh,
parking
okay,
today.
understood.
We're going to have to take that on at a succeeding session. But I just want to honor Mr. Olson's comments about, okay, well, you don't want to be doing one piece without the other. I think we got to pretty good consensus on those three pieces.
But I think there's value in sending forward the whole package, the parking items, as well as the related issues, along with the affordable housing issues.
It's a good point. We just don't have time to do all the parking today. We got through at least the affordability piece, and then we can look to staff to schedule the time to do the parking piece.
Right.
Okay? All right. So, all right. Any last comments on the affordability piece at this point? And staff, you want to guide us on how we can get in another time to deal with the parking piece?
The next Housing Task Force meeting is on December 6th, so we would take that up at that time. And in the meantime, we're going to work with the consultant on the affordable housing piece and sharing it with the technical committee and developers so that we can possibly come back at the next meeting with more information on that. So.
Okay, great. All right.
I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, if everyone will be here on December 6th? It's close to the holiday season.
I will not.
Well, you're not going to be here?
Okay. Well, I think we're...
You're here?
Yeah. Anybody else?
I expect to be here.
We're losing members as we speak. All right. Well, with
Thank
that,
you.
then we'll see you on the 6th, and this meeting is adjourned.